Campers, what is the scariest, creepiest, most disturbing thing that has happened to you in the woods? Went on a group camping trip in the middle of nowhere, Arizona, only to wake up and hear something sniffing the outside of our tent. My immediate reaction was that it was likely a bear or some animal that came across our sight. And just maybe that my dumb friends didn't tie up the garbage? Seconds later, I can hear the sniffing go to the tent next to ours, and everyone in mine grabs one another quietly to acknowledge that we're all awake and we were aware of what's happening outside. Moments later, a friend in another tent popped out and started to scream and make noise. He had a gun too, hoping it would scare off whatever animal was in our sight. Turns out, it wasn't an animal, it was some guy who had gone through our coolers, food, and also decided it would be okay to sniff our tents. Our friend chased him off, and we immediately packed up our crap and left. Edit. Alright, since this is floating at the top, I thought I would share a second creepy camping story. A year after the above incident, my stupid friends and I went back to the nearby area thinking what we encountered was a one-time incident. This time, we thought we would outsmart any possible creepers, and instead of camping in our tents, we all slept in the beds of our trucks and SUVs, cause they can't possibly sniff a Toyota Tacoma. Anyways, it's the middle of the night, I'm passed out in the back of my SUV when I suddenly feel a bright light on my face. Naturally, I would have woken up, cussed, and asked who was doing that. However, I instantly knew to pretend to be asleep and not let the individual know I was awake. I laid there next to my girlfriend, hoping she would do the same as and I kept an ear out for any unusual sounds, like sniffing, and all I could hear was a friend snoring by the campfire. After the light left my car, I heard the person walk to the next truck and shine his light on my friends in there. I slowly looked up, and it ended up being some older guy just standing there, staring at everyone while they slept. I waited until he left the campsite, and I busted my ass out of that truck and woke up my friends, most of which had also been pretending to sleep and realized what was going on. Story number 2. My family went camping every summer when I was growing up. We usually bounced between Virginia Beach, Asatog, and this god-awful place called Westmoreland. One trip, we were in Asatog, near the beach, and we had 2 tents set up in different parts of the site. Sometime in the middle of the night, my mom woke up, which woke me. She was sitting up straight but completely still, and I looked over at what she was staring at. In the moonlight, there was a silhouette of what looked like an old woman looking into our tent. Long, weary hair and everything. I was young, so it terrified me, and I started asking my mom what that was, who was outside, and once I made noise, it spooked the old woman and she took off. And that's when we realized she was actually one of the feral ponies that live on the island. We had set up that particular tent on one of their trails, and they were going down to the beach. Story number 3. I live in a rural town surrounded by mountains and forests, so camping is almost a weekly event in winter. The one I can't shake, though, is when me and a friend broke off from our group of other 16 to 19-year-olds to camp by a better fishing spot about a mile away. We only brought one tent for the group, so we built a lean-to against a large boulder in a clearing. I couldn't sleep because I had the feeling something was watching us. I assumed it was a mountain lion, which isn't that big of a deal considering their behavior, so I threw some more logs onto the fire. I looked up from the fire, and under the light of a full moon, there was a man standing at the edge of the clearing about 80 yards away. I was frozen and couldn't take my eyes off of him, while he assumedly stared back. He walked off in the opposite direction after about a minute or two. I doubt he had any ill intentions, but I sat there holding my friend's 357 the whole night. Edit. I didn't wave or call out because I was terrified. I was frozen since I was 16 and inexperienced. Nowadays, I would call out and see what's going on. Also, mountain lions are not a concern. I've been stalked by them and have stumbled face to face with a few. They aren't a big issue or fear if you understand them. Story number 4. Not exactly camping, but kind of. I lived in a very small town once when I worked for my laptop. Like, population 200 small. I was in a small cabin in the woods, though next to the highway. One day, I was walking my dog and heard 2 gunshots somewhere nearby. I didn't think much of it as it's a hunting area and it's kinda redneck-like. The next day or the day after, a truck pulls up. I didn't even know anyone in this town, so it's weird and I'm put off. Guy calls me over, says he's my neighbor, asks if I heard the shots. I said yeah. He claims it was his neighbor taking pot shots at his house over a land dispute. Doesn't ask me to be a witness for him or anything, just if I heard. Okay, seems really odd to me. Never met this guy before, and when I say neighbor, I mean 500 meters to 1 kilometer away out of sight. The guy sees my dog digging somewhere unimportant, and all of a sudden starts trying to tell her not to do that. Gets out, and she's iffy of him. Says, here, watch, calls her over, grabs her, and tries to do the stupid effing Cesar Chavez dominance, holding the dog on their back thing for really no effing reason, and she starts yelping. I'm like, dude, stop. He then asks me whether I have any guns myself. I say no. He says he is a great dog trainer, and he asks me to go over and mow his lawn, and please ensure to bring your dog. in the strangest way, just like that. Please ensure you bring your dog. I can't describe it, but his mannerisms and the way he talked was just plain creepy, especially that line. He leaves soon after, and I'm thinking, God dang, I just told this guy not only that I heard the gunshots, but that I'm unarmed here. How do I even know if it was his neighbor, like he claimed, and not in fact this weird dude has shot someone at his home and is trying to see who might have heard or witnessed it? I wouldn't go to his house, not an effing chance. Horrible feeling. Then he kept showing up asking why, calling and texting asking why. I gave him my number before realizing how weird he was. Really adamant though that I go over there. Turns out the guy is a total alkie. Lost his wife, lost his job, lost everything. Very dangerous mental state. Nothing to lose. The small store owners in town explained the guy to me eventually, and apparently he's the most hated guy in the valley. Bad reputation, and I'm now really freaked out. I found it very hard to sleep after that. Cabin in the woods, nobody nearby that would hear any commotion, ample angles for the place to be approached from the woods, and just a can of bear spray and a knife. And the guy knows I have no guns. I would be kept up for hours listening at night for any movement outside, as it was dead silent there. Well, one night, in the middle of the night, my dog starts to growl, then growls more. I don't hear anything, but it didn't matter. Every room in that cabin had a window but the bathroom. I just got up, grabbed the knife and the bear spray, and locked myself in that effing bathroom for hours, listening. I think I eventually fell asleep in there. I don't think I've ever felt that kind of dread. I just pictured this lunatic sneaking up with a shotgun to take me out for maybe having heard him murder someone with a gun days earlier. Like, man, it was just awful. I moved, but unfortunately, the new landlords were equally creepy and even started trying to steal my dog, even though they had 3. Literally, I heard them discussing it, how they had to make themselves the in crowd so that she'd want to be with them, and hand-feeding her dog food when they thought I wasn't looking. Must have just been the small town thing. Totally strange people in that town for the most part. They went to market one morning, I packed up all my crap into my uninsured van with no license and my pup, and effing bailed that town and never looked back. Good God, it was hills have eyes crap, I'm telling you. So, I don't know about you guys, but I would love to live in a town with 200 people for a while. Maybe not the one that OP was describing, but the sense of small, intimate community, I feel like that's cool, seeing the same people every day, hearing all the same stories. If you embarrass yourself, it lasts for the next 15 years. Isn't that great? I love small towns. Anyway, next story. Story number 5. I was walking around the bush hunting for upland birds, and I walked through a bit of a valley to a shortcut to get to another area, when I came across a guy standing on the trail with an AR-15 at the ready position. Instantly, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up instinctively, knowing this wasn't a place I wanted to be. Trying my best to stay calm, I say to the guy, "Hey, just out hunting birds, how are you doing?" And then he says to me, "Fine, I'm hunting deer." And side note, deer season wasn't open. AR-15s are not legal for deer, and he wasn't dressed for deer hunting. As a matter of fact, he looked homeless, hadn't changed his clothes or bathed or shaved in several days, obviously, and looked emancipated. Think of the scariest 50-year-old meth addict you can think of, and put an AR-15 in his hands, and you're probably close. I say to the guy, "Do you know the best way for me to go find some birds?" And then he replies to me, "Well, I imagine you might find some back the way you came." And his voice noticeably got sharper with the "back the way you came" part, and I obviously took the hint. I don't know if there was a meth lab or what just down the trail, but I was certainly happy to leave. I reported the incident to the sheriff the next day, but I don't know what or if anything ever came of it. Story number 6. In the late 80s, I was in my early 20s, and 2 of my friends and I went camping in Central Florida. 2 of us were working for the Park Service at the time, so we were able to camp for free in other parks in the state. Both of us had done a lot of camping before. Me, I grew up camping with my family on every single vacation all over the state. For the other friend with us, this was her first camping trip ever. We were camping in the youth area, which was empty that weekend, and it was quieter and more isolated than the regular campsites. Later in the afternoon on the second day of our trip, we were all sort of spread out in the area of the campsite, being within shouting distance, but enjoying a little solitude. I was collecting firewood, and every now and then I'd kind of feel like someone was watching me. I'd look around, see and hear nothing, and then shrug it off and go back to what I was doing. Later on, around sunset, we had the bonfire started. One of the rangers who lived on site about a quarter-mile away came over with a truckload of firewood and a 6-pack of beer. We all sat around talking for a while, and well after dark, we could suddenly hear what was probably a bunch of teenagers fooling around on one of the trails a couple of miles away. Since the trails were closed at sunset, the ranger and my coworker drove off to shoo them back to their campsites. My other friend and I were just relaxing around the fire, talking a little, mostly enjoying the night and the peace and quiet. All of a sudden, I had a cold chill go over me. The hair stood up on the back of my neck, and out of nowhere, I was terrified. I tried to ignore it, but it kept building. I didn't say say anything to my friend. I didn't want to scare her. Then I glanced over at her just as she glanced at me and she said, "Do you feel that?" And I said, "Yeah, I think maybe we'd better get to the car." We both felt like we were in deadly danger, but no idea from what. We started walking at a casual pace, not wanting to appear scared. Then, halfway to the car, we looked at each other again and simultaneously broke into a dead run. We reached the car, jumped in and locked the doors and turned on the headlights. I sat there with my pistol, feeling like it was totally inadequate for whatever was out there. We both just sat looking straight ahead. We were afraid to look around. I had the feeling at one point that if I turned my head and looked out the window, I'd see something that would drive me insane. I don't know how long we sat there. It was probably just a few minutes, but it felt like forever. Then it just left. We could actually feel it going away. A few minutes after that, the other two came back in the truck. We kind of laughed it off afterwards, but I'll tell you, I've never been that scared before or since. I've faced a lot in my life, and nothing has so completely terrified me like that. I don't know what it was, but I'm still convinced we were in terrible danger. So I was waiting to say it later on throughout the video, but this story was poignant enough to piggyback off of. I want one alien or ghost story throughout this video. That's all I'm going to say. One alien or ghost story. It might have been this story, though. I'm going to be honest with you. But anyway, next story. Story number 7. Went camping by myself way out in the middle of nowhere in north central PA. Drove on dirt forest service roads for over an hour, and then hiked about 6 miles in on a barely recognizable trail. There were no signs anyone had been in the area recently. The trail was almost completely overgrown, no footprints, spider webs everywhere, etc. I didn't really have a planned stopping point. I was just looking for a nice place to camp, but the trail followed a creek in a valley and was very rocky and not flat. As the sun is starting to set, I come upon a fork in the creek with a nice flat spot just on the other side. As I got closer, I saw all sorts of stuff lying about. I crossed the creek and started looking around. There was a tarp on the ground by a stone fire ring, a log about a foot in diameter that had been chopped with an axe, and a little bit away I found the entire contents of what you would imagine to find in a hiker's backpack: food, cooking set, camping pad, first aid kit, etc. All strewn about on the ground, but no backpack in sight. There was a pile of clothes down by the creek that looked like it had sat through the last rain, which was the day prior, and a towel hanging from a tree. There was an area that had been clearly used as a toilet for maybe 10 to 14 days based on the amount of toilet paper piles. And the strangest thing, though, was this cage about 4 foot square made out of saplings tied together. It was framed where the edges of a cube would be and then had crossbars diagonally on each face. But it wouldn't have kept anything inside because of how much open space there was, and obviously wouldn't have been very sturdy since it was only made from saplings. I ended up deciding to set up camp there because it was nearly dark and I didn't really have much choice unless I wanted to hike out in the dark on an unrecognizable trail. I had a 12-inch knife on me and I kept that thing in one hand the whole time I was there, thinking to myself some crazy guy was gonna jump out and try to eat me. All night I barely slept and kept thinking I was hearing things. And then as soon as the sun came up, I packed up and got the F out of there. Everything turned out fine though, no crazy cannibals or anything, but it still really bugs me because I don't know what that stupid wooden cube frame cage thing was. I called the Forest Service for the area and told them about it and even sent them pictures. They said they would send a ranger in to check it out and clean it up, but I never followed up to see if they figured out what it was. The ranger on the phone told me it was probably either someone with a still nearby, someone growing pot, or just some loner living out in the woods. I roamed up the sides of the valley before I set up camp and didn't see anything. A still seems unlikely because of how far you would have to carry equipment in, and the area isn't really great for growing pot. So maybe it was just some guy living out in the woods, but why the cage? If there's any interest, I can probably find the pictures. And also, last year I was camping out in Colorado and woke up at about 2 a.m. to a pack of coyotes running through my camp howling. Sounded like at least 20 of them. My dog was asleep next to me the entire time. Probably best he didn't wake up though. He would have gone nuts. And I'm told coyotes are much bolder in packs. Story number 8. Scariest was camping with my wife when a windstorm blew up. I'm talking trees being blown over, branches falling, the works, in a forest full of jack pine. The creepiest was camping with my best friend. We were in a semi-remote camping area, drivable usually to get to it, but definitely only with a 4x4. It was a semi-maintained camping area as there were a couple of fire pits, a few rotten picnic tables, and a run-down outhouse. Parks checked this place once a year or so. So we get there and start setting up when my buddy wanders over to the crapper and opens the door. He stands there for a second or two, and then closes the door and goes to the second one, goes in, and comes out a few minutes later. He comes back to me and says, "Go check out that first one." I assume someone crapped on the floor or an animal got stuck in there and died or something. Nope, 3 full backpacks. And I am talking big bags. Like the bag I have, that size I use for week-long trips. So, we are nosy, and we open them up, and 2 are full of good quality gear, nothing unusual, but the third is full of Skittles, bulk bags, small bags, regular, tropical, sour, every flavor and size of bag you can imagine, just full of effing Skittles. We camped for 4 days, never saw a soul, bags still there when we left. We let the COs know when we got to civilization. Who left all that gear? Why did one person pack 80 liters of Skittles? Don't know, but it was weird. Oh, and another scary one. Dog and I were backpacking. Spur of the moment overnight trip. Wasn't far off the road or anything. So I just have a tarp up as a small shelter, small little fire. Wasn't really hiding per se, but wasn't being too obvious. Just dozing off when I hear a truck rip up and a bunch of drunken voices. Then the shooting started. Now they probably didn't know I was there. I was parked on a different road and hadn't realized I had walked as close as I had to the second one, but I didn't like being in the area when a bunch of drunken yahoos are shooting off guns, especially when I was fairly certain they were shooting in my direction, based on the lay of the land, so I put the pupper on a tight leash and headed out ASAP. Story number 9. I was camping in a valley by myself with no cell service. I stayed late on a trail and ran into a nice local dude as it was getting dark. He showed me a local camping spot close to the road and the river, but camouflaged. I had a fire, drank beer, and listened to my friend's comedy podcast. I was loud and visible. Because it was dark already, I decided to sleep in the back of my truck under my topper next to all of my gear, as opposed to setting up my tent. The next morning, I made a fire, cracked a beer, and started making breakfast. Then I noticed that there was a man at the edge of my camp. He comes closer, but never looks directly at me. This dude looks homeless, has a long ratty beard, and has at least 100 plastic grocery bags tied all over his clothes. I comment about how nice the day is. No response from him. I offer him breakfast. Nothing. He sort of paces around the perimeter of my camp. I offer him a beer, but he just turns around. The dude is just standing there, back to me, wandering around. I'm realizing that there isn't going to be any good happenings. I had my bear spray and buck knife super close, and I give him an ultimatum. I'm like, dude, you are either going to acknowledge me or leave immediately. I had my bear spray and my buck knife super close, and I give him an ultimatum and I say, hey, you're either going to acknowledge me or leave immediately. He ignores me. So I grab the bear mace and walk a few steps towards him, and he sulked away, and I threw my crap in my truck and left that place right quick. I wonder if he'd watched me during that night, and I thank my laziness for staying in my truck instead of a tent. Story number 10. I used to go backpacking all the time in the mountains, and have some good stories, but hands down the scariest thing I've ever encountered is lightning. First real experience was at Philmont in New Mexico. Great backpacking area, lots of fun if you're a scout. Not fun when it storms, though. My group was eating dinner one night when lightning struck a tree at about 50 feet from us. It was unexpected. There were dark clouds, but the sun was shining through still. It just shredded the tree and all of us jumped. Dinner ended up in the dirt. We had a couple of other close experiences during those 2 weeks, but that was the closest. The second and most terrifying experience was when we were in Kings Canyon, CA doing the Ray Lakes Trail. One of the campsites was by a river. Now, it's prone to rain in the Sierra Nevadas, and we were at the bottom of a tight granite valley that showed some signs of historical flooding. Not my ideal choice of a spot to sleep, but it was a NPS site, and that was the end of our day. At about 2 a.m., I was awoken by a flash of light so bright I swear I could see the tent through my eyelids. Before I could even think, the thunder roared so loudly I thought the earth was tearing itself apart. It's hard to accurately describe the sheer power and sound that comes from being right next to a lightning strike. The night didn't end there either. We were directly under the storm, and the lightning just kept coming. The thunder never ceased to roll, and the rain was torrential. The lightning was so constant as well, you could almost see through the walls of the tent into the forest around us. It was light daylight out there. I thought I was going to die that night, either from a lightning strike or a flood if the river rose. And the third experience was in Switzerland. We were up in the Alps and got caught in an open field, rocky area during a descent as a storm rolled in. Again, lightning strikes far too close for comfort and no place to shelter. Just squatting down and praying we wouldn't get struck. Amazing trip, but that moment was not enjoyable. I love watching lightning and rain from inside a cabin or covered porch, but if I'm outside and a storm is coming, I've almost an animalistic fear that screams at me to get indoors. Lightning scares the living crap out of me if I'm not covered. Story number 11. I work as a counselor at a summer camp in Southern California. The place is very out in the woods, so we get all sorts of animals wandering through, from deers and foxes, coyotes howling in the distance, to a mountain lion that's been spotted in the area. The camp also occasionally had a spiritual haunted vibe. There are a couple of creepy and weird spots, some things in the area that we think show the place has been inhabited in the past, ghost stories, etc. One night after putting my kids to bed, I was standing outside our cabin talking to another counselor when my friend Sadie comes running by with her entire teenage girls' cabin, maybe 12 of them, all dressed in black and freaking the F out. She screams at me that she thought they heard a ghost, and once her kids were asleep, she'd met me back here to explain and investigate. Sadie is normally the level-headed type, not to freak out easily, so this really caught my attention. She meets me back by my cabin maybe 30 minutes later and explains what was going on. She took her campers on a night hike, had them all dress up in black and pretend to be ninjas. It was all fun until on their way back, they passed a particularly dark part of the trail when they heard off in the distance just beyond the tree line what sounded like a faint "help" from a small child. But each time they heard it, it got more and more distorted until it no longer sounded human, yet still sounded like a child yelling for help in the distance. Naturally, they freaked the F out and ran. Me and Sadie decided to be good counselors and go investigate the sound of a small child yelling for help. As we walk over to the area of the trail, we hear it. It didn't sound like a small child anymore. It sounded like a demon screeching out its best impression of a child. And it didn't sound like it was coming from any point source, but more so was coming from an entire mountainside. And we book it back to the safety of the main part of camp where we tell this story to anyone who will listen. The next day, the camp director had a meeting where they told us to tell our campers not to freak out at the sound of bobcats in the forest, as they are harmless, but do make a high-pitched yelping sound at night. Our friends wouldn't let us live that one down all summer. Story number 12. When I was a kid around 8 or 9, my mom, grandma, brothers, and I went camping at a small camping spot about 2 hours from the town we lived in. We went there a lot and even had a particular campsite we had slowly built up over the years. On this particular trip, we had my aunt and uncle's dogs with us since they were doing military tours. They were both well-trained bird dogs, but usually really calm and friendly. The first night on this particular trip, and Star starts growling in the tent at about 1 in the morning. My mom, thinking something is outside, arms herself and investigates with the dogs. As she gets out of the tent, Star and Ariel would not let her move to the other edge of the campsite, and both get into attack position while herding my mom towards the car. This is while also keeping themselves in front of the tent. By this point, we are all up and with a group of kids under 10 freaking out. For a reason she can't even explain today, my mother packs up camp and gets us all into the car to head home. After about 10 minutes out of the campsite, a car starts following us, and the dogs get in the back and just growl. By this point, everyone was in borderline panic mode, and my brothers were crying the entire car ride home. As the town came into view, you have to cross a huge bridge to drive in, and the car was still following us. And as a kid, you make stories to yourself that nothing is wrong, and the car behind you is just full of scared people too. Yet, as we start crossing the bridge, the car stops and just turns around, speeding back the way we came. We stopped at a gas station and everyone was near meltdown mode, and my mom goes in to get cigarettes. But Star would not let her back into the car until she could see her clearly. This and a camping trip a few years later convinced me camping is no longer my thing. So I gotta piggyback off this story and just say that I have never really been interested in camping myself or doing all the outdoorsy stuff. I'll go on a hike or something. But these stories, even though of course they're horror stories, just further solidify why I don't want to go camping, because the worst case possible scenarios are really bad. Okay, why was this car chasing this family? Why is lightning striking this man everywhere? Why do creepy people come out of the woods? I don't know, and I don't want to find out. I don't want to go camping. I will stay home and I will take a nap. Next story. Story number 13. More disgusting than anything, we went to Shenandoah Naughty Park in Virginia with a college buddy. JMU is super close, so he and I took some camping gear from work and headed up there to catch that Perseid meteor shower. Hiked a good ways in on an out and back trail that ended with a cliff overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains and was awestruck. I set up my 2-person tent and he rigged his hammock with the tarp a few yards back, and then we sat on a cliff and we watched the stars go by. But here's where life gets real for me. We got to bed pretty early that night, and around what I could only guess was 3 a.m., I start hearing tapping sounds all around my tent. Now, I knew it wasn't raining or him playing a joke on me, so I started to panic a little. At this point, I've been fully awake and alert for 10 minutes and can still easily hear this tapping. I finally grow a pair and decided to turn on my flashlight, and what do I see when looking straight up through the mesh top of this tent? Hundreds and hundreds of centipedes. They were falling like a gentle drizzle all around my tent, and I felt like I was on an episode of Fear Factor. Long story short, I didn't sleep that night, obviously, but my buddy, who was about 15 feet away, was out like a rock. In the morning, there were dead centipedes everywhere. I'm normally fine with bugs and insects, but not swarms. Don't know how we didn't see any sentai carcasses the day before or when we were setting up camp. Story number 14. Finally, something I can answer. A few years ago, a group of friends and I went camping together, and the campground we wanted to go to was full, so we ended up camping deep into the forest, several miles away from any other campers. Well, the first night we woke up at about 2 in the morning to drumming and singing. It sounded like a traditional Native American type of song and music. I don't know how to describe it, but I got the feeling that something was very wrong. It was like the feeling you get when something bad happens. And the sound didn't sound like it was coming from anywhere in particular, but was just all around us. Anyways, we were completely freaked out and decided to sleep in our car. The next night, we decided to go see if we could find any other campers near us that may have made the noise. We literally saw no sign of life anywhere around us, and we were in a somewhat clear part of the forest, so if anyone was camped near us, we would have seen them. We were still freaked out, but decided it was probably nothing, so we spent another night. The next night, we woke up at the same time again to loud music, but it sounded closer this time. We also felt like something was just wrong, and were extremely freaked out. We were too freaked out to go to sleep, so we just stayed in our tent awake all night. The next day when we woke up, we decided to pack up and see if the other campground was open, and it was. When we stayed there, nothing else happened. To this day, I really don't have an explanation for what that noise was. I don't understand how we could have not seen any other campers, and why they would have played music in the middle of the night. We also weren't on tribal land. My best friend, who was one of the other campers, is Navajo, and she said the music was similar to music she heard in tribal dances and rituals. I'm still freaked out about the whole ordeal, and it's hard to explain, but my body was just telling me that something was very wrong when this was happening. Story number 15. Used to camp all the time when I was a kid, but I moved away from the mountains for a while. This was my first camping trip in over 10 years, and I was solo. It was a long drive to my destination, and I had gotten a late start. So I pulled off on a national forest back road to camp for the night. It was twilight, and I was getting ready to sleep in the truck, stuffing my sleeping bag and air mattress in the back of the cab, when I noticed that the woods are dead quiet. Not a bird, not a squirrel. I was well off any main roads. I didn't think too much of it until I heard a Steller's jay alarm call. Corvids, jays, crows, and ravens will alert to predators. I look up just in time to see a shape pass between two trees way the hell too close for comfort. Definitely an animal of some sort, but all I saw was the top of the hindquarters, no head, no tail because of the bush and the angle of the trees. It was tawny, and my first thought was deer, until I realized that whatever the hell it was made no sound. None. The ground had years and years of leaf and pine needle built up. Deer crunch when walking through that. Only a predator moves that silently. Yup, it was a mountain lion. I figured that from its direction of travel, it would have to cross the creek I was next to, and I would see it as it left. It never crossed the creek. I hurried up, getting my sleeping bag, and rolled and stuffed in the truck with the growling feeling that I was being watched. I finished and slammed the tailgate of the truck as hard as I could. I heard the cat make 3 big bounds away, then stop. I got in the truck and stayed there till morning. That was my most terrifying and thrilling experience in the woods while camping, and I still camp alone most of the time. I've had bears walk past my tent and heard wolves howling on a hill above my campsite, but nothing compares to that mountain lion. Story number 16. I worked in an outdoor sleepaway summer camp a number of years ago. During a late-night staff meeting, we heard what sounded like a baby crying in the woods. Bone-chilling scary. Myself and 2 other counselors decided to check it out. We headed back into the woods only to discover a dying rabbit on the bank of a stream, with its blood flowing down it. We were all absolutely mortified. The poor thing was ripped open. Thinking, stupidly, a fox had done it, one of the people I was with told us to go back and he would put it out of its misery. Within sight of the staff house, the counselor who stayed behind comes running past us covered in blood. We catch up and get back to the staff house where the meeting was just wrapping up. Here we discovered that the thing trying to kill the rabbit was a cougar, and a big one at that. He only got away from it by throwing the now dead rabbit at it, which is why he was covered in blood. The camp was put in wildlife lockdown for the night, and multiple wildlife rangers were called in to help find and trap the cougar. Story number 17. Went on a group retreat type thing over a fall weekend about 8 years ago. Husband and I and our 3 girls, all under age 10. This was an annual occurrence, but we were flush that year as a result of our company doing well. As a result, we avoided the communal bunkhouses and decided to rent a camper. The RV rental place explained that it would cost the same for for 3 nights as it would for 2, so we decided we'd return it on Monday despite the retreat being over early on Sunday. So the weekend went great. It was super hot and we were happy to have AC. We didn't notice it at the time, different people being in and out all day, not staying much in the RV over the weekend because of activities, but the previous renters hadn't bothered to clear out the septic lines in the camper. By 6 Sunday evening, it stunk horribly and was backing up into the toilet. My husband was anxious about the rental company blaming us, so he decided to go to the Walmart in the neighboring town for some Drano. Mind you, this particular location, while open all year, is rarely occupied outside of retreats. I'll confess that we haven't been back since this occasion, so the details of why don't really come to mind. But as I recall it, it was previously owned by a church in the area, and they used it mostly for their own purposes and events. So, husband leaves around 8:30 p.m. for Walmart. It's an hour-plus round trip thanks to the rural area and skinny back roads, and I start straightening the camper out, packing our belongings and getting the kids settled. He'd been gone for about 40 minutes when I had gotten everything squared away and delivered the last glass of water to an overexcited child who'd been on the move all day and was having trouble relaxing. I curled up in the bed to read and wait for my husband to get back in case he needed help. The lights had been out for about 20 minutes when I started hearing a clicking sound coming from the window behind the bed. I stilled instantly and ran through a self-reassuring checklist. It's the trees scraping the glass, nature, a sound in the environment nearby, or an axe murderer. That was an option too. I got up and walked very slowly to the kitchen. The noise followed. As I was climbing up into the loft area over the truck can, I heard the door handle rattle, and then the scraping sound. I'd gotten a knife as I passed through the kitchen, which I was sweaty clutching as I holed down on the edge of the bed in the loft guarding my children. I eyed the cabin, making sure every access point was locked, and hoped whoever it was definitely a whoever at this point, would go away. I leaned left and right, trying to get signal in my cell to call camp security or my husband or anyone, but it wouldn't dial. I waited, panicking. It was about 5 minutes of torture later that I saw headlights through the portholes on the side coming along the winding road to the RV sites, and my husband entered the cabin looking at me weird. He scoffed at me for being a city girl and told me that people didn't break out of prison and attack women and children in random rural campgrounds. I expressed that I had heard the door rattling and that it wasn't a coincidence of nature, but he brushed me off. We passed the test of the night without incident, though I was too on edge to sleep. The next morning, we drove into the town to return the RV. On the once-over demanded by the rental agreement, the manager came around to my husband and asked if he knew what happened to the rear window. It seems that someone had used a switchblade or some similar item to remove the gasket from around the window where the back bedroom was, where I'd been reading the night before. There were gashes in the paint consistent with knife marks, and the gasket had been sliced off. The window lock was also damaged. It seems whoever had done it also tried inserting the knife into the door's lock and between the jamb and the lock in another attempt to gain entry. Fortunately, they didn't get in, and we were not charged for the damage to the RV. Needless to say, I never consented to a solo camping trip again, and always go in a larger group now. Safety in numbers and all that. Still makes the hairs on my neck stand up. Story number 18. I love to choose my outfits, but they tend to be very skin tight, or you see some skin. Anyway, I was walking home from school one day and I was wearing a skirt with shorts underneath and stockings. The shirt doesn't necessarily matter for this part. While walking home, I was listening to music on high, trying to block out the world from a long day at school. I felt something brushing up against me behind me and didn't really think anything of it. I was a bit entranced in my music and could have even been humming. I noticed something brush up against me again, so I glanced behind me to see a man about 2 inches close to me. I screamed in surprise and apologized to him for screaming because he seemed pretty flustered himself. He walked in front of me and sped away. I couldn't tell, but I think he was trying to look up my skirt. That would explain the weird feeling of wind while he was behind me. If that wasn't strange enough, it took me a while to finally get home. I stopped off and took some breaks to try and calm down. When I finally got home, I noticed someone I hadn't seen around my apartment. I thought I might have had a new neighbor because there was a guy under my stairway. He looked just like some kid who went to my high school. He was wearing a hoodie and basketball shorts. When I came up to my apartment, he moved directly underneath my staircase, which has holes in it so you can see and look up and see the person through the stairs. I can notice this guy was definitely trying to look up my skirt. I had a pretty smug look on my face because I had worn shorts. When I had gotten to the top of my stairs, I noticed he pulled out his phone and was trying to take pictures. I was feeling extremely scared at this point. I had forgotten all about the guy from before, and I couldn't seem to unlock the door. My front door has an electric phone lock, and my phone had not been able to connect to the lock for some reason. I realized I couldn't get into my own house, and there was some creepy perv trying to take pictures of me right underneath my stairs. I looked underneath the stairs to see if he was still there, and he most assuredly was. Not only was he there, but he was also self-pleasuring right underneath my stairs. He had his wiener out and was just there. I about had a heart attack. I had no idea what to do. I couldn't run down the stairs and leave because he was right there, and I couldn't go into my house because it was locked and I couldn't connect to it. I decided to call my dad and ask him what to do. My dad called the police for me, which was probably what I should have done in the first place, but I have no time to think. I had sat out of eyesight and yelled at the perv to leave, but I didn't know if he was aggressive or if he would respond. I decided to just make a run for the community office at our apartment complex. I made a plan to find a phone there and find people so he couldn't harass me if he got the chance. I made the choice and started running down the stairs into the office. I looked back and he wasn't there. Relieved but still full of adrenaline, I ran to the house. My dad finally unlocked it. Later, the police came by and asked me some questions, said they would keep an eye out, but they never found him. I haven't seen him since, and I hope it stays that way. Well, everyone, I have to say, this was a very fun camping story out in the woods, wasn't it? The title is, what is the scariest, creepiest, most disturbing thing that happened to you in the woods? I don't think OP saw that last part. Sorry that it happened, absolutely, but definitely not relevant. Mostly, but not completely relevant. Slightly off topic, B-. Anyway, next story. Story number 19. I am really loving this thread, so I'll add a couple more stories and experiences. First one was in New Mexico, and I stepped off the trail to take a leak. As soon as I start to piss, I hear a rattle start shaking. Turns out I had begun peeing on a rattlesnake I had not seen since it was green in color and blended in with the grass. I effing bolted out of there while pissing myself. Made for a fun afternoon of walking. The second story, my tent mate sleep-talked, which was fine, but one night at that hour, when everything in the world is dead silent, he sat up in his sleep and just started screaming. Un-effing believable how much that terrified me. To wake from deep sleep to blood-curtailing screams. He doesn't remember anything, that a-hole. Third story, was up in Denali once, and the camp had a one-room cabin fisherman used seasonally. We checked the logbook and someone had written that a grizzly had been in the camp 2 days before. Hard to sleep knowing a grizzly bear has been in the area, especially if you see repentant of its presence around. Those things are huge and have a temper. I've seen them from a distance, but I've zero interest in meeting one up close. Story 4. Anytime you're in the high country with bears, it gets a bit tense at night. You wonder if you stored all your smellables correctly and away, if your deodorant will attract them, if you've any accidental leftover food on your gloves. Waking up to a bear sniffing around your tent or bumping against it isn't pleasant. Even knowing they'll run off if there are no cubs, since they spook easily, having an animal pressing in against the wall of the tent ain't what I call a good time. And story 5, there are just some scary stories that seem to resonate in the land. I commented on an earlier post that I'm not a religious or spiritual man, but I can say with full confidence I've experienced some supernatural and animalistic crap. You'll be sitting by the fire or walking along the trail and suddenly something is just wrong. So very wrong. The world feels immense and there is something far more dangerous than you hiding in its shadows and just watching. The terror that sets in, it's almost indescribable. You know whatever it is, it can kill you and there's nothing you can do. You hide, you get to your tent or cabin or car, praying you make it to safety before whatever is out there catches up. Now, I've never met whatever it is, and I pray to F I don't. But I promise you, there are plenty in this thread and in the wilderness who will describe the feelings I've described here. I know full well where the tales of nightmares in the dark come from. If you don't camp or backpack and want a taste of this feeling, watch The Ritual on Netflix. I'd say the first half of the film chalks up the fear of not knowing and being hunted very well. Story number 20. I lived by a state park as a kid. One of those places super close to a city, so it's very overhiked. Like, you can't walk a minute without passing several other people. This area eventually leads up into a vast mountainous area, but that's many miles away. Rumors of wild pigs, but no bears, and the most dangerous things are rattlesnakes that just want to be left alone. All that to set up for this point, wildlife has been basically chased out of their refuge. The biggest animal I had seen was a squirrel until I was 10 years old. The first incident, my dad and I were taking the slightly less used path. It was basically an out-of-the-way trail that ended the same, but was rougher, no bicycles, and an added risk of seeing the aforementioned rattlesnakes. I was watching my footing when my dad let out an "oh crap," and I looked up and saw two of the biggest bucks I have seen in person. This is a no hunting park, so really big, and we were really close as my dad had been watching out for me. My dad is desperately looking around for a tree I would learn later, while I go, "ooh, deer!" Then my dad shouts out, "No," as I step towards the deer to see if they're friendly. One lowers his head, and I'm thinking it wants to be petted. My dad realizes I am closer to the deer than I am to him, and this causes him to freak the F out. The deer are focused on me, one head still down, until a branch hits it across its face. It barely phases the effer, though. The other one takes off immediately. After some cursing from Dad, it finally prances away like no big deal. My dad was convinced that buck was about to go for me. I got an education that day that even nice animals can be dangerous. I would learn that lesson again with a nice herd of cows on the beach a year later. Later that fall, a mountain lion was spotted from a busy trail, kind of far, but it's been like 20 years since a sighting. It turns out, despite the crowds of people, conservation efforts were paying off. By the time I was in my 20s, deer were jumping into our backyard to eat our roses. Owls were nesting right next to the main parking lot. The wild pigs weren't rumors anymore. The lions could be heard screaming in the distance at night. And the rattlesnakes still just want to be left the F alone. Story number 21. I went camping with a very large group a few years back. There were probably 45 of us, and the main campground was full when I and the two girls I was planning to share a tent with pulled up. No problem, there were a few spots across the road near the river, so we were by ourselves, and the second night I was awakened by animals moving around outside our tent. One of them growled, and it sounded very much to me like a cougar. I don't own a gun, and I left my knife in the car, so we were defenseless. I woke up the girl sleeping closest to me, thinking that the other girl probably wouldn't handle the situation well. So my awake friend and I just prayed and sat there, tense, ready to fight for our lives until the cougars eventually went on their way. It was a hellish night, and I didn't sleep at all after that. But turned out the cougars were a couple of guys from the other campsite playing around making animal noises and mucking around our tent. We're all in our 30s, by the way. I'm not mad, but I'll never go camping again. Story number 22. Camped in the bottom of a valley with pretty steep rocky walls on either side on a backpacking trip in the Sawtooths in Idaho. In the middle of the night, we were all woken up by the sound of a rockslide, something that happens often in a place like that, I'm sure. Not like a whole mountainside giving away or anything, but at least a few large boulders tumbling down. We could hear them getting closer and closer, smashing through large trees and destroying everything in their path. I thought about running out of my tent, but it was pitch black out, and even if I had a clear view of the rocks, I wouldn't be able to see them or where they were going. Decided there were no options with any better odds than just staying in my tent and hoping I picked a lucky spot. We couldn't find any signs in the morning, and the rocks might not have gotten any closer than a quarter of a mile for all I know, but that feeling of helplessness was pretty disturbing. Story number 23. This was not hiking, but it was in a remote place in the woods. My uncle built a house out on some acreage he has that is pretty far out there. There is not another house within 2 miles of his at least, and most of that is woods and cow pastures. But his place is beautiful. He built it all by hand and has a wonderful wraparound deck, perfect for family get-togethers. We were all out there, probably 20 adults and 5 or 6 kids, for a party one day. It was one of those summer times when it is blazing hot, but the light breeze is cool enough that you don't notice it after a while. I had been there hanging out all day, and when I was asked to run into town and grab some more groceries, I packed up and headed out. Got the groceries and everything was fine. As I drove back, it was starting to get dark out, and it was that time of year when dark comes fast. It was pitch black out there when I finally arrived. As I pull up, I notice something is sitting in front of my car, facing the house. It was not disturbed by my headlights, but it does glance back at me once. And it was an effing panther, just chilling there, watching the party. And as I sit there for a second watching it, I notice that it has specifically placed itself near the edge where all the kids are running around. After I have my headlights on for a minute or so, it kind of looked back at me again as if to say, "Okay, I was caught, oh well," and then it gave the most human-looking sigh and just walked off into the woods. I sat there for a bit before building myself up to get out of my car and go to the party and tell everyone. Story number 24. Did I ever tell you about how I was camping below the Salcantay Pass in Peru? We were set up in small tents, inside a big garage-sized tent with 4 smaller tents. I was awoken late in the night by something pushing against the whole side of my tent, something big. We were above 10,000 feet, and my mind began to whirl with the worst possibilities of what it could be. A puma? Some sort of bear? Are there bears or something unknown, like some sort of Andean yeti? Anyway, it began to grunt. I could really hear heavy breathing. This thing had mass. It was no human. I really did not want to wake up everyone with a yell. I was trying to be courteous, and more likely, 1, I didn't want to look like a wimp to the other guys on the trek, and 2, I didn't want to look like a scaredy cat to the lovely women on the trek. I summoned my courage, took some deep breaths, and began to unzip my tent. I crawled out, and there I was, face to face with a huge long-horned bovine. This cow stared at me in the darkness with blank black eyes. Now, I was raised on and around farms, so I sat to read the animal's body language. It seemed to relax and let out a snort. This had to be a domesticated animal, left by shepherds there in the highlands to feed. Now what do? Using slow movement, I began not quite a cowboy singing to the little doggies on a drive, but variations on those sounds that you hear every farmer make when they want to get an animal to move. I guess the animal had entered the shelter to get out of the cold and wind, and though I felt for the critter, I'd rather not sleep next to a 2,000-pound animal with just a thread of fabric between us. I slowly made my figure large and approached with arms wide, and I slowly backed the bull out of the tent, so a sort of reverse matador, and he complied. And that is when I defeated the beast at Tanagra. Story number 25. I was living in Brazil, and a friend and I decided to do a one-night out and back through mountainous rainforest terrain in one of the southern states. We mostly wanted to get some exercise and do a gear shakeout before going on a longer trip in Patagonia. The experience started out really tough. We were doing almost constant climbing and it was hot. Humidity was near 100% through lush vegetation. Eventually, we were pretty much in clouds and completely drenched from sweat and humidity. It was kinda hellish, soaked to the bone with no chance of drying out. Fortunately, at that altitude, it gets below freezing frequently at night, so there weren't many insects or animals, only birds. We hiked for probably 8 hours with little progress. It was slow going through the tough terrain. At early evening, we came to a flat spot, the first we'd seen in hours, and decided to make camp as it was starting to pour. I basically made camp in several inches of standing water. I was beat anyway, so I just sat in my tent reading. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a girl singing in the distance. The singing kept coming closer and closer until she was singing right at our tents. She pushed past us and the singing drifted off. She was singing maybe a lullaby or children's song about rain in Portuguese, but it sounded very strange. An hour later, I got woken up to the singing in the distance again. She was coming back towards us, singing the same rain song. As she passed us, I could hear a little exasperation in her voice. She continued singing and went back in the direction of the trailhead. Another hour later, I was again woken up by her singing as she was again coming back towards us. Except now she was also crying. She continued to cry and sing as she moved past us for the final time. We both woke up that morning, looked at each other and said, "What the F was that?" and then got on our way. It was very eerie at the time, and I don't have an explanation for it. We were in an extremely isolated location, and the trail was definitely only used by recreational hikers. So I really can't say why this woman was out wandering, singing, and crying at 3 a.m. Okay, so I've got some questions about this story. Did OP not see the woman at all? OP doesn't specify if they actually visually saw the person, just heard. OP says she pushed past them and started singing and drifting off, but that doesn't actually specify if they saw her. Was she disheveled? Was she okay? Does OP speak Portuguese? OP says they knew it was a lullaby or a children's song about rain, so clearly they must have understood something. You didn't want to ask this lady? The first time, okay, maybe a little weird. The second time when this person came through, you didn't want to stop and say, hey, or the third time you didn't want to record, take a selfie? No investigative work? You're not a little inquisitive at all? If that was me, I'd probably want to look into that a little, but anyway, next story. Story number 26. I had a pretty long stint in Boy Scouts, and one time we were camping on a reserve in the Midwestern USA that's normally used in the summer for large sessions, i.e. 1,500 scouts scattered across a large campground. We were camping in October, however, and camp wasn't in session, so it was just our troop of 30 or so guys plus the adult leaders on this massive empty reserve. Now, the summer session has a pseudo-Native American society that serves as a leadership craftsmanship program, sort of an extension of Boy Scouts. The Order of the Arrow would be a similar example. Part of being in the society means crafting a lot of ceremonial outfit type things, so A, you learn how to work with your hands, and B, the ceremonies look pretty cool. Well, it was the last day of our trip, and it had been unusually hot and calm for October. The last thing we do before piling into the cars is a litter line. Everyone lines up, and we walk the campsite to ensure we leave no trace. We're walking along when one of the guys says, "Hey, I think I found a coup." Now, coup are fairly valuable out there because they're a specially shaped bead that you only get when you join the society. Everyone's coup is unique, and it's usually shaped to reflect the person who joined. One person says, "Whoa, man, what kind of coup is it?" And he replies with, "Well, it looks like a tornado. And whoosh, this cold, hard wind came out of nowhere and started pushing the trees and kicking up leaves everywhere. And the timing, what in the hell? Hadn't had so much as a breeze for 3 days. We decided our litter line was good and got the heck out of there. Society members don't just lose their coup. I wonder what happened. Story number 27. This will get buried, but I have never gone camping or out into the woods at night after this trip. A few friends and I had a long weekend, 5 days off from school, and we decided to go camping in the northern GA mountains. We packed a big 10-person tent, there were 5 of us, 2 guys, 3 girls, and loaded up my buddy's truck. He and I had some experience being outdoors, camping, hiking, hunting, and he's an army vet, so we packed really well, and had all sorts of amenities like propane stoves, grill, fold-up cots, portable shower. We were in it for the whole weekend. We left Wednesday afternoon and parked the truck in a small town and started hiking into the woods to find a spot. It was a fairly normal hike until we got about 4 to 5 miles in. The first time we noticed something strange was when we came into a little clearing in the woods with a big pond and tiny lake in it, and we stepped into the open area and everything stopped. No birds chirping, no squirrels running around, even the clouds and the wind seemed to stop moving. My buddy and I thought, well crap, there's gonna be a predator nearby, and took out our handguns, just in case. I've never seen a bear in Georgia, so we figured it was a mountain lion or maybe some coyotes. My friend and I were looking around the edge of the clearing, and he grabbed me. He nodded across the water, and when I looked, I saw what seemed to be a woman standing just at the tree line. She was maybe 150 yards away. We assumed she must live somewhere nearby, and so we continued walking past the water and clearing. As we headed back into the woods, I looked over my shoulder at where she was standing, but she was gone. The sound of the force returned once we got into the trees. We made a campsite about 2 miles past that as it was getting late, and we didn't want to be stuck building camp in the dark. We got everything unpacked and set up and built a fire, popped a couple of beers, and sat down to hang out. Now, there was a girl I was interested in on the trip, and we had been flirting, so after a few beers and the sun was down, we snuck away from the fire under the pretense that she wanted help setting up part of the tent. We started fooling around, and after a few minutes, she stopped and looked at me funny. I asked what was wrong, and she said, "Nothing, it just got really quiet." We both quickly got dressed and headed back outside to the fire. The others hadn't noticed anything strange and didn't mention anything wrong, except joking with us that it took us a long time to fix the tent. On the first morning, we found that the propane stove had been turned on but not ignited and had gone empty overnight. None of us had used it. The second morning, we noticed some things had gone missing. A lantern we left outside by the fire was gone. My crush's sweatshirt she left on a little folding chair and stool gone. We figured we just misplaced things or someone had used them and put them somewhere else. During the second full day, Friday, we were looking for a waterfall that we read about online that was in the area. We were following the river upstream when everything went silent again. My buddy nudged me while we were walking and indicated up to the top of the hill next to the river. I looked up through the trees and was just able to make out the figure of the same woman. Same clothes and all, just standing. I couldn't tell if she was looking at us or not, but she was just standing there. My buddy told the girls he thought he saw a mountain lion following us and was gonna go scare it off. He hustled up the hill making a lot of noise and came back about 10 minutes later. He said he scared it off to the girls, but told me aside that the woman wasn't there when he got up there. Well, we found the waterfall and put it out of our minds as the girls decided to skinny dip in the river, and boobies can solve anything. We hiked back to camp and found it in a mess. It wasn't totally trashed, but it was clear something had gotten into our stuff. We told the girls it was probably raccoons. We both took our guns to bed with us. And that night, crap went sideways. I remember waking up because my crush was squeezing my arm. We had been cuddling together, and I opened my eyes, and she hushed me before I could ask what was wrong. There was complete silence all around the tent. I looked across the tent, and my buddy was sitting halfway up looking around. We both stayed awake for the next 2-ish hours until the sun started coming up, and then packed our stuff, and we all headed out. The entire hike back into town was eerily silent. There were a couple of points I thought I saw the woman through the trees, but never got a clear sight of her. We avoided the lake completely and got back to the truck in what seemed like half the time it took to get out to the camp. After we were safely on the road back home, the girls and my buddy all started to tell everyone about moments they thought they heard or saw the woman all weekend, but were too freaked out to mention it out loud, like she would go away if we ignored her. The wild part was none of us could describe her face. It's almost like it was blurry. No idea who she was, but I've never been camping or hiking at night since. Story number 28. My best friend and I, both female, went to go camping to France when we were 16. We bought a ticket for the train, we live in Germany, and since we didn't have a lot of money, we figured we would just find spots somewhere to camp in the wild since we did this at home all the time. We grew up in a really rural area. So off we went, slept a few nights at train stations or guarded beach bars. Very nice people helping us out until we reached a smaller town right by the Mediterranean. We set up our tent on the beach and a storm was coming in. We tied the tent to some concrete pillars for garbage cans so it wouldn't fly into the ocean, and there was an older guy watching us while he was fishing. He waved at us and we waved back. Didn't think anything of this. Went to go to sleep at like 9 or 10, and while the storm got stronger and stronger all throughout that time. But in the middle of the night, my best friend woke me up by quietly poking me. She whispered there was someone outside the tent touching me through the fabric. We both sat up, took out our knives, and just froze. There was someone poking through the tent and brushing against it. After a minute, I said F it, and I opened the door/zipper, and guess who was outside? That effing fishing guy. He tried to tell us that there were apparently rats eating the food we left in our pot outside, and that's why he wanted to wake us up. We asked him why he's still there in the middle of the night. It was like 2 a.m. by then, and he said he's meeting his friends to go night fishing. It was storming and raining at that point, so that was a fat lie. And we lied back to him and told him that our parents are at a hotel in town, so he thinks we're going to be missed when he unalives us. We untied the tent from the concrete and started packing up our crap. We just wanted to get away from there. He didn't try to touch us. He just watched us and told us his friends were going to be there soon. So we hurried up and the tent got ripped away by the wind and flew into the ocean. So there we were, 2 16-year-old girls. No tent, almost no money, and some creepy guy on a lonely beach in the rainstorm. We just packed up the rest and bolted. He didn't follow us and his friends never showed up. We found a spot in the town surrounded by walls, like a little patio, so we stayed there until the night was over. Tried to find a hostel the next day, couldn't find it, took the next train home, and F this. We wanted to stay for 2 weeks, but we made it up to 4 days. And I had my period. It was the holidays of my dreams. Story number 29. In high school, I went camping in Ocala National Forest with some friends. At one point late at night, a few of us snuck away from the rest of the group. We explored a trail that left us at the edge of a highway. While sitting in what we thought was a secluded area, a car drove by and everyone decided to duck down. The car stopped and we heard the doors open, slam shut, and then heavy footsteps were running towards us. We got up and started running back to camp. We could hear the footsteps gaining on the pavement as we entered the forest, followed by the crash of large bodies breaking through the underbush. At one point, my buddy Rob stopped short and yelled, "Banana spider!" And suspended before him was a banana spider the size of my hand. She was in the center of a beautiful web. But I, on the other hand, remembered that dudes in rural Florida were chasing us. I screamed, "Not today, MFer," and shoved Rob through the spider web and went back into camp. Story number 30. 2 things, same trip. Not really the woods, but might as well share. Me and my friends, Mexican graphic design students, went to the Laguna Salada, salty lagoon in Baja California, Mexico, to watch the Milky Way and shoot some star trails photography. The Laguna Salada is a vast patch of salt-encrusted land that was once a lake. It dried quite a bit ago, and you can actually find ancient bleached seashells if you check carefully. Anyways, we arrive at an entrance from the highway and drive around 500 meters deep into the Salada. We come to a nice spot with a lot of bushes at one side while clear on the other, and we thought this was perfect as the bushes would block out the car headlights from the road. We stop and get out of the car, then we all notice this strange hissing, rattling sound all around us. Imagine being surrounded by invisible people playing maracas, some far, some closer. We are so puzzled and fascinated by the sound that we start to throw out theories about what it could be. A friend says it might be an echo from the cars, others say they're insects, and one jokingly says, "It's probably effing alien probes, man." With that put aside, we set up the tripod, camera, shutter switch, we shoot some test shots, and everything is right. We leave the camera with the lens open to shoot the star trails. We grab some lanterns and decide to go exploring. After walking about 15 minutes, one friend says in a very fearful voice, "2 men are coming at us." And we were like, "Yeah, bro, nice try." But he repeats, "Not kidding. 2 men are coming at us. They got assault rifles." And almost instantly, the 2 men yell, "Turn off the flashlights, turn off the flashlights now." And we're like, "F, he's right, man." And we are scared crapless and do as the men command. They get close and say, "Don't move, keep your hands down, and don't do sudden movements." And then they start asking questions in a very aggressive tone. "Who are you? What are you doing here? How old are you? What are your names? How long have you been here?" etc. After explaining ourselves, they start whispering crap to themselves while pointing their rifles at us. We're all frozen with fear, believing we're going to be executed right there for being at the wrong place at the wrong time. One of the men says, "Go back to your car and keep taking your photos, but do not get near that bush patch because," and I quote him, "rifles tend to misfire in there." And as we're walking away from them, I was pretty sure we stumbled into a bunch of effing narcos doing some shady crap there. I'm sure we are going to be sprayed from the back. I'm just walking slowly as our flashlights are off, waiting for that hot lead to enter my back. And you know how they say that your life flashes in front of you when you feel you're close to death? I can assure you it's not a lie. Past Christmases come to mind. Me opening my super sweet Nintendo, graduating from high school, past girlfriends, etc. I even start to get angry at life, telling myself I'm going to get effing killed by a scumbag narco all because of some effing photos. But thank God, nothing happened. We get the message and decide to nope the F out of there because we do not want to become another number in Mexico's effing narco wars. As we're all grabbing our crap and packing up, we hear a loud rattling in the floor. A friend turns a flashlight on, and it turns out to be an effing baby rattlesnake inches away from my friend's feet in attack posture, with rattles shaking like crazy and all ready to strike. We cannot believe how stupid we were. All the sounds we heard in the beginning turned out to be effing rattlesnakes. All around us, narcos and effing rattlesnakes. We noped the F out of there and never came back. Story number 31. I really love thru hiking and climbing, so I sleep outside for a great part of summer each year, almost never using tents because they are heavy as F and are also prohibited in most parts of my mountains. I had many scary encounters with animals, mostly due to the inhuman shrieks that they can produce, but I will tell you this, in all of the nature, nothing is as scary as people. This is why I prefer camping deep in the woods to just being outside of the city limits. Because it's always better to find families of wild hogs going through your stuff at 3 a.m. than to find a family of coked out drug addicts going through your stuff at 3 a.m. But anyways, here are two of the stories of encountering people that came to mind. The first one, we were actually using tents because this was more of a get-together and drink thing with classmates at a nearby lake, so the night is surely upon us and we decide to gather some wood in the nearby forest to keep the fire going throughout the night. Me and my pal take on this task, and as we approach the woods, we see there is another tent pitched right out of the side of our camping site. As we pass it, a dude pops out of the tent. We make small friendly chat about us staying there and him just camping and whatnot, and then we excuse ourselves that we need to go get some wood for the fire. All fine and dandy, nothing unusual. Camping folks are usually chatty and friendly, except for two things. By the setup of the tent and camping ground, he must have been there for a few days, and he planned to stay there for a while, which is okay. There's lots of photographers doing this, as the place is famous for its sunrises, although I still shiver thinking about all the heavy tarps lying around. And secondly, he advised us to split as there were two paths going through the woods so that we can cover more ground, which we did because why not? He looked like he knew the area. So I am walking alone through the woods, my mate taking the other path, which was directly above mine, and he could still see down on my trail. When I hear him shout my name, I turn around to see what's happening, and I see the guy from the tent following me on the trail, which he saw from above, wielding an effing machete. The guy says that after we left, he realized we didn't have any axe or anything to chop down the wood. Although we did say we were collecting the wood and chopping it down would be illegal there, so he thought he would help me with that, which I politely refused and got the hell out of there, meeting my mate who was already on his route there. So we came back to the camping site with next to no fuel for the fire, and everyone keeps making fun of us, that we are paranoid, and the guy surely wanted to help. Whatever. We proceeded to drink, and night falls. We've almost forgotten about the incident, and all is swell again. When I see a headlamp approaching our campsite, it's that guy from the tent coming to our site. He is bearing a bunch of wood in his arms, saying that he knew we didn't take much of the fuel, so he brought us some. Then he walks all around our campsite before putting it down. I mean, there was really no need for that as the fire was in the middle, and he was checking the tents, asking whether this is all of us and if someone else is coming. Not creepy at all. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, he tells us to enjoy our night and gets out. Understandably, everybody is creeped out by now, and different theories pop up, such as that he brought the wood only to make sure that we won't kill the fire before we go to sleep, so that he knows when that happens, or that the occasional flash from the direction of his campsite is the flash from his binoculars. Well, no one went to sleep that night, and we were not drinking anymore. After the sun went up, we took 2-hour naps rotating guards and took our crap and left as soon as possible. The other one, we were on a climbing trip and slept under the stars really deep in the woods, and well off all the known trails in place in the areas as sleeping there is prohibited, and the rangers are very strict about this, issuing very large fines if they catch you. So essentially, we were hiding deep in the woods. We cooked some great dinner, and man, nothing tastes so good as MREs after a full day of climbing camped out in the mountains, but we drank some wine too, talked crap a bit, and went to sleep as we were really tired. At about 2 a.m., we were all woken up, there were 4 of us, by voices, by crap loads of voices. It sounded like a school trip somewhere in the distance. Lots of kids talking to each other, presumably walking in a group. That itself was a bit scary, as a bunch of kids walking in the woods at 2 a.m., they must have been off any trails, as we went on purpose out of the reach of any of the known trails. Well, no one is talking, and we all sit there and listen. The voices pass. Then the second wave of a similar group of voices passes nearby, and then we hear someone approach our sight through the woods. There must have been more of them based on the sounds they were making, and then it happened. It was a group of 5 kids, roughly 13 years old, walking in the direction of the voices. They walk around our sight, silently greeting us and nodding in our direction as they pass about 3 meters from our sleeping bags and continue towards all the voices. To make it all more creepy, none of them had any headlamp or flashlight or any source of light. It was full moon, so the visibility was good, but still, I have no idea what that was supposed to mean. But it was really weird and honestly scary. It could have been some Boy Scouts, as that was well-established outdoorsy place, but the whole area. But still, a bunch of kids alone in the woods, well off any known trail, walking without any source of light at 2 a.m., just right by us? There's a lot of weird things happening when you camp, but trust me, nothing is as scary as other human beings. Story number 32. I am pretty late to the party, but my mother has a great camping story. In their late 20s, her and my father were teaching in Lesotho. On the holidays, they would go on camping trips in the massive parks in Zimbabwe. They were young and stupid and didn't know the dangers of camping in Africa, and they had my sister with them, who would have been less than a year old at the time. One night, they were camping in a tent and had my sister between them when they heard sounds outside. They said it sort of sounded like someone coughing. My sister was making baby noises, and it seemed like it attracted more coughing to animals outside. Soon it sounded like a whole pack of something was outside the tent. My parents had no firearms and no knife or axe close by. One of the animals then started sniffing the tent, and it seems like it was trying to dig under it to get to my now crying sister. My panicked parents were trying to find a way to save themselves and my sister, and in a panic-induced rage, my mother, with all the might and glory that only a mother who is scared for her child's life can produce, punches the snout of the hyena sniffing the tent. To this day, my parents swear that the animal screamed in terror, and the whole pack ran off. Story number 33. Growing up in the woods and going camping, my family and I have our fair share of bizarre and scary stories. This one I just can't seem to wrap my head around, even to this day. My parents owned 35 acres of property in the deep Rockies, about 2 to 3 hours away from our home. We spent as much time as we could camping there, as we all loved it. It was secluded and beautiful, and we had a lot of freedom there as kids. My parents were both experienced campers and backpackers, and had both grown up in the mountains. One day, we had up at night, arriving at the property at around 9 or 10 p.m., and we were all tired and start to unpack the tents and such from the car. The minute we get out, though, we all get a strange feeling. It didn't feel normal or good. We had encountered wild predators at this point and knew the feeling of being watched, but this was like being watched from all sides. We also noticed that there are no sounds. It is dead silent. Normally, we would be hearing all the insects and occasional owls, nighthawks, or bats, and just the general hum of a forest, but nothing. We all kind of laughed nervously and maybe mentioned a few things, but got to work setting up our tents nearby. This is when the real strange stuff starts to happen. We begin to hear rustling in the branches around us about 10 feet off the ground. It almost sounded like large creatures like monkeys or raccoons jumping from tree to tree loudly. And many of them. I have never ever seen raccoons have the ability to do something like that, and these sounds were clumsy, unlike birds. It gets louder and becomes extremely unnerving. At this point, the tent is set up and my parents put my brother and I in there, telling us to stay inside. They go out with flashlights trying to make sense of this bizarre activity, and as they are outside, we start to hear these bizarre calls. I have never ever heard anything like this before or since. Honestly, it almost sounded like humans mimicking some kind of primate holler or screech. There was an odd human-like aspect to it, and it's like they are calling and responding to each other from every direction, along with the branches cracking and rustling. My parents came back to the tent and they tell us they couldn't see anything at all. I remember how shocked and frightened my mom looked, and it scared me because she was a badass that would stalk bears to get a good photo. Both my parents were not easily frightened in nature, or at all. We are all huddled together in the tent, confused, scared, and unsure of what to do. The sounds are so loud and everywhere, it almost sounds like some crazy storm outside. Our dogs are cowered in between us all, totally freaked out. My dad decides to go out again, and I remember as he finishes unzipping the tent, the sounds stop, just like that, in an instant, and the oppressive, weird feeling is gone. He and my mom go out again to investigate, and again, find nothing, except fallen branches and some strange marks up high on some trees. They come back, talk us down, and somehow manage to get us to sleep. We still talk about it to this day. None of us knows what happened, and have no explanation. Like I said, we had some crazy and strange things happen to us, but never anything remotely similar to what happened that night. Story number 34. I had moved to Southeast Washington for work after college. The Blue Mountains were very close by, and being a hunter, I was very interested in learning the land for hunting season. I went on several solo scouting trips into various areas, always picking locations that would put me the farthest from any public road or access point. I find in hunting that most people are too lazy to get much off the roads, so less competition in the remote areas. Being outdoors has never been anything new to me. I grew up on a farm and ranch in Montana and have spent most of my youth working outside and dealing with animals. Not only would I have to tend to the various livestock, but I was raised into hunting and above all enjoy calling animals. I was 10 when I fooled my first coyote that I was a dying jackrabbit, and since then have mimicked everything from rodents to bull elk well enough to fool predators and big game routinely. I know with the explosion of bow hunting popularity that animal calls have become more commonplace, but I don't think you can appreciate it to the same extent a country boy can that learned how to echo back to the calls of cattle, horses, chickens, etc. before old enough to attend school. I'm not bragging here, I'm just laying the groundwork that I have a very trained ear for animal calls. So I set out one afternoon to run up the blues to scout for game. I got a late start, but no real worries as most of the spotting of animal activity occurs at first and last light. I was able to only hike a couple of miles from the road before I needed to find a spot to camp and watch for game. I climbed up a ridge and found a small, somewhat level spot to set camp. I had a pretty good view of the surrounding area, but ended up only seeing a couple of whitetails before dark. I kept a dry camp, no fire, and just turned in early for the night to get a good start in the morning. I was awoken at about 1 a.m. to probably the worst headache I had ever had. It would be just a surge of pain, then taper off, then come back. I was very careful about my hydration on the pack in, so I knew it wasn't dehydration, about my only real concern on the trip. So I'm lying in my bivvy with this on-again, off-again pulse of pain, trying my best to diagnose the cause when my ears finally tune to this strange sound coming from the mountainside above me. My thoughts move from the headache to this animal call. It's not matching any of the calls I know. It's not matching any of the general patterns I know. It's too loud and repetitive. It's unique. It's very, very strange. I know instantly that this is a large mammalian call. And you can say to yourself, how does he know that? And all I can say is, I have a lifetime of experience like I stated above. It's definitely a mammal. It's big with a deep hollow vocal chamber. And although this is evident, I tell myself it is likely some WA bird to ease my mind. After all, Washington must have different birds than Montana. So now I'm stuck that if I focus on the sound, I can't believe my bullcrap that it is a bird. And as soon as I try to not think about the sound, the surging pain of my headache is unbearable. Close to 2 a.m., I make a judgment call and pull camp and head back to the truck, with this call repeating the whole time before the decision. The way I hiked to my camp was pretty direct but rough. However, there was a gated road just above my camp that circled back to the main road where my truck was parked. Distance would be longer to follow the road, but easier to travel in the night, as it led me directly towards this call before it would circle back to the truck. So, with my 1911 in hand, I walked that road out. The interesting part is, the sound stayed above me as I walked out, always directly up the mountainside, and after climbing up the road only maybe 200 to 300 yards distant, the animal clearly shadowed my departure, following up along the mountain a ways. As soon as I dropped down on the mountains, my headache completely cleared. I have since decided that this was likely attributed to altitude sickness, since I was also having a hard time regulating my breathing, but the real fun came when I got home and I had to start searching bird sounds for Washington, at this point at about 3 to 4 a.m., and my search was not producing anything close to what I had heard. And then that small, nagging voice finally had me Google Bigfoot call. And damn, if I didn't find an audio file of what I had just heard almost instantly. The call was so unique that on my drive home, I grabbed a mouth reed and was able to duplicate it quite quickly. There was no doubt in my mind about what I heard. Of course, I have doubt of any sound on the internet labeled Bigfoot whoops, because who can say what call a mythological creature really makes, and how could you ever be sure? I can say that I never heard it again, even on return trips to that area. I even walked through the area it originated from, and it was a thick, nasty north slope face full of trees and vegetation. Story number 36. I had moved back to Georgia from southern Oregon, don't worry, I returned to Oregon, for a while, and the city life was a culture shock after the peace and tranquility of the remote state of Jefferson. I decided I needed to get out in the woods for some sanity, so on Valentine's Day, I went camping outside of Helen in the Appalachian foothills by myself. I drive as far as I could up the dirt road, 7 miles maybe, until the rest of the road was closed off for winter. Nobody on the drive anywhere. Set up camp by the creek right there, had a fire going, still daylight, and a truck pulled up out of nowhere on the road. It was 2 guys, and I'm a female in my 30s by the way, and I hate to stereotype, but they looked like the Appalachian hillbilly part. They also had a bottle of liquor in their hand that they were drinking from, asked why the road was closed, peered around my campsite from inside their truck, I'm sure noticing just one chair by the fire. I said we were only staying for one night and looked at the tent maybe to insinuate my man was in the tent. They left, but they were creepy. It got dark and I got in my tent and I kept thinking about those guys and I could not shake it. No cell reception. I thought maybe I could sleep in my truck bed that had a camper on top in case they came by and checked out my tent. But why would I put myself through that? So defeated feeling because I just wanted some nature magic to soothe my soul, I packed up my camp and put the embers out and got on the road. No way I would have gotten sleep. I pulled out of the site and around the next corner, hours after I had seen them, they were there, in their truck, waiting in the dark. They pulled out in front of my truck after starting theirs quickly and started driving down the windy 7 miles. I had no reception, was super scared, thinking of what I could if they stopped, ran their truck off the cliff. What if they had a gun? I made it to the main road and they took off. And I stayed in a hotel and told the hotel clerk to call the sheriff, and this was their license plate. I know I probably narrowly escaped SA or death or both. Happy Valentine's Day. Good thing I never celebrated. And now I'm back in Oregon and very happy, by the way. Story number 37. Not technically camping, but close. My parents own a small cabin on a fairly isolated ridge atop a nearby mountain. My friends and I go up there a lot and often end up watching scary movies. Well, one night after having some drinks and watching the Blair Witch Project, we decided to go on a 1 a.m.-ish hike. So the 5 of us started walking, huddled close together. Even with the alcohol blanket on, the cool temps and wind made it brisk. There was a new moon, so beyond the foot or so of visibility the stars offered, we were walking blind. We made it to the bottom of a ravine, gully type of feature, and sat down in a circle using a small lantern we brought to enjoy a short break from the darkness. About a minute after we sat down, a blood-curdling scream rang out from what sounded like the ridge above us. It sounded like a woman being murdered in an 80s horror film, but with a tone of genuine terror. We all stared silent for about 10 seconds until we heard the scream again. Not saying a word, we turned off the light and all started sprinting back to the cabin. We made it without encountering any demons or victims of said demons, but it was terrifying. Anyways, turns out it was probably a mountain lion. So at the end of OP's story, they provided a video of a mountain lion screaming, and I heard a few seconds of it, and it is kind of scary. And the top comment of the video is, that guy was right. It does sound like a woman being brutally murdered, so seems like OP might have been onto something. Anyway, next story. Story number 38. I used to work at a Boy Scout summer camp. Every week, I had to take a big group of campers to a secluded spot for their wilderness survival badge, where they had to build a shelter out of sticks, leaves, etc., and sleep in it overnight. The spot was only about half a mile away from the main camp, but we took them on a circuitous route that made it seem really secluded. Anyways, on this one night, all the campers had made their shelters, we had cooked dinner, and we were all just sitting around the campfire. It was getting late, maybe 11, so I sent all the campers to their shelters for the night and started cleaning up the fire. That's when we heard in the distance what sounded like church bells. They were pretty faint, but myself and my fellow staffers could definitely hear them. They went on for about 30 minutes, ringing over 30 seconds or so. We were all a little creeped out as there were no churches or towns within 20 miles of us. After the bell stopped, though, the singing started. It was too faint to hear the words, but it sounded like church choir music, but a lot of people, and a lot more enthusiastic. Also, it was almost midnight at this point. The singing went on for well over an hour, sometimes quieting down until we almost couldn't hear it, sometimes getting so loud we thought it was getting closer. All of the campers were super creeped out, but I lied to them, telling them there was a church service going on in camp and there was nothing to be scared of. Eventually, at almost 1 a.m., the singing stopped. I found out a few days later that there had been a large KKK rally only a few miles away that night, and that's what we had heard. Story number 39. Hiking up a 14K through the woods. My dad grabbed my hand to help me up an embankment, and my hand was apparently ice cold. We stopped the hike and my vitals were checked. They couldn't find a pulse on me all the way up until my armpit on both of my arms. The guide's sat phone wasn't picking up a signal either. May have been an equipment issue, but we made the decision to keep on hiking to base camp about an hour away and treat me for hypothermia, as I only had the outward symptoms and I was showing them having no pulse in my extremities. My pack was taken from me and my brief checkups were performed every 15 minutes. After a couple of hours at base camp and being treated, some warmth returned to my arms. We decided that the next morning we would huff it off the mountain just to be safe. The next morning, I woke up with icy arms again. We, my dad, one of our guides, one of the more experienced hikers, and myself, left most of our gear with the rest of the group to carry down at their leisure, and unencumbered, we made it off that 14K in a little under 3 hours, alternatively jogging and sprinting. After getting to the hospital and being at a lower elevation, blood flow returned to my arms and hands. And that is probably the most dramatic dramatic diagnosis of Raynaud's syndrome. Raynaud's is the unusually thicker muscle membrane around the capillaries, arteries, and veins. Normally, at lower temperatures and high altitudes, your body will constrict those muscles in order to force more blood to the body's core. When my body constricted those thicker than usual muscles, it completely cut off the blood flow instead of just slowing and restricting the blood flow. Bodies are weird and awesome. Story number 40. I love the outdoors, and I'm kind of a loner, so I have several stories from times I was out adventuring alone. Lots of encounters with animals, but the most disturbing were run-ins with other people in places that they shouldn't have been. One stands out as particularly alarming to me. I was driving up in the mountains in western Colorado on a road that led to a now deserted ghost town that was a bustling mining town in the late 1800s. On my map, the road ended at the ghost town, and I planned to hike a few miles into the woods and camp and hike around for a few days up there. High altitude, rapidly changing weather conditions, and no cell service. This was 2005. Driving up the steep road, my car began to overheat. I reached the town site as the engine temperature reached the critical point. I turned off the engine, popped the hood, and determined that, while the car was not totally disabled, it would have to cool down for several hours before I could drive anywhere. My new plan was to let it cool down completely and hope that I could drive back to the nearest town that night without overheating again. It was all downhill, so I could probably roll for most of it if need be. I spent the next few hours walking around the town site, which was mostly just a grassy field. There were the remains of a few log cabins and stone foundations, a few mine entrances, piles of tailings, and what was left of the town graveyard, but not much else. As the sun dropped below the horizon and night began to fall, I heard a car driving up the road. It pulled up next to my broken-down car, stopped and shut off. I started walking towards it to see why another person would be driving up a dead-end road at nightfall, and perhaps ask if they had any tools or coolant I could bum from them. A guy got out of the car, a beat-up white Honda Civic, and how he got up that washboard mountain road, I'll never know. He was a few years older than me, grizzled-looking with an unkempt beard, wearing tattered jeans and a dirty flannel shirt. He asked if I needed help, and I explained my situation. He was reserved but not unfriendly and told me that he was a miner from a small and probably illegal/unlicensed mine who had been injured on the job and without health insurance and had found himself homeless and living out of his car. He said he knew these woods and the ground beneath them like the back of his hand and moved around from place to place setting up camp or sleeping in his car where he wouldn't be bothered. He said he knew of an abandoned mine site with an old but intact cabin about a mile away from where we park, and he was heading up there to squat for a few days before he moved on. He asked if I wanted to check it out with him, and I agreed. I got my pack from the car, which contained, along with the usual camping stuff, my .44 Magnum revolver. I usually keep it loaded when on adventures like this, but only have the 6 rounds in the cylinder with no spare ammo. I carry it for defense from animals, mostly, and holster it on my belt. When the guy saw it, his eyes went wide and he asked what I intended to do with the gun, and I explained it was just for self-defense from animals, nothing more. That seemed to satisfy him, and we explored the area around the car a bit. I stopped back at the car a few times to grab things I had forgotten, including a 6-pack of beer, and one of those times I decided to take my revolver off my belt and put it in my pack. I knew I felt something off and was on my guard the entire time around him. I even made a note describing him and recording his license plate number in a notebook in my pack, in case I disappeared and someone needed to know what happened. These are the kinds of precautions I take when I want to undertake risky adventures. We hiked the short distance to the mine site, which was one old cabin, a dilapidated steel derrick above a vertical mine shaft, and a bunch of junk strewn about. After stashing my pack in the cabin, we walked over to the mine site. We climbed up on the derrick and sat on a small platform, and I shared my beers with him. He said this vertical mine shaft was about 700 feet deep, which he knew because the mine he had worked in had horizontal shafts that intersected with this one, and we dropped our empty beer bottles down the shaft, listening for them to smash at the bottom, but they just disappeared into the blackness. We had some other bum fun, like rolling around old tires down the pile of mine tailings, before going back to the cabin to set up for the night. The inside of the cabin was full of trash, but there was a cast iron stove in decent shape and we lit a fire for warmth. He shared his food with me, a tin of kippered herring and some crackers, and we set up beds on opposite sides of the small cabin. As we lay down to go to sleep, he asked me out of nowhere if I had brought my gun along. I felt a flash of uneasiness and told him that no, I had decided to leave the gun in the car when I went back to go get the beer. In reality, I had most certainly brought it along and had placed it under my pillow. We talked no more and I fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, and although it was nearly pitch black in the cabin, I could see that he was sitting up in his bed. I couldn't make out his face or even where he was looking, but I lay still and watched him for what felt like an hour. He never moved, and I eventually fell back asleep. We were awoken in the morning by someone knocking on the cabin door. He and I both looked at each other, wide-eyed, sure we were about to be confronted by whoever had the title to the old cabin. After waiting for several minutes, minutes, we crept up to the windows of the cabin and looked out. No one was there. A bird of some kind had been pecking on the cabin walls, which sounded exactly like knocking. Well, we packed up and went outside, and he asked me to help him look around the woods for some stuff he had hidden a while back and wanted to retrieve. I helped for a little while, but we didn't find it, and I was restless to try to get back to my car down to the nearest town and start to figure out how to get home. We parted ways, and I hiked out of the woods to my car, which started right up, and I headed down the mountain. I got home late that night and started putting away my gear. I got to my revolver and, out of habit, opened the cylinder to unload it now that I was home. It was empty. I thought about everything I had done since the last time I had checked the gun. I know it was loaded when I put it under my pillow. I never unloaded it or even removed it from my pack between the cabin and my house. I went through everything in my pack, every pocket and gear bag. I went outside and looked through my entire car. There was not a round to be found. In the middle of the night, while I slept, the homeless man had found my revolver under my pillow, unloaded it, and returned it to where I had put it without waking me. He had a loaded gun inches from my head, and I never even knew it. I have no idea what his intentions were. I like to think he was acting out of self-preservation, unsure if he could trust me not to murder him in the night, but then again, he could have unloaded it, so it would be useless if I needed to defend myself from him. That was the closest I've ever come to being murdered in my sleep, and one of the scariest realizations of my life. I've since been much more careful to conceal my gun at all times. And epilogue, I actually ran into the homeless man again years later, again in the woods, about 100 miles away from the cabin that we had shared. He recognized me, and I recognized him, but he acted very cagey and standoffish. So we spoke for a few minutes, and I continued on my way. He's probably still up there. If he hasn't died or been killed by the mountains, they can be very unforgiving. Story number 41. After reading through all of these creepy, odd, and some absolutely horrifying campsite stories, I can't help but add my own 2 cents. Before I tell my story, I'd like to reemphasize what many here have already brought up, which is that humans are the most dangerous animals to encounter in the woods. I began training to ride the entire Colorado Trail in March of 2008. 27 segments, 535 miles on a bike. I was new to bikepacking, eager to try out all my new ultralight backpacking and bikepacking gear. I attended a half a dozen free advanced mountain bike maintenance classes at the Bicycle Village. I initially started out going up for one night at a time, strictly on segment 1 of the CT, as that was the only segment not completely blanketed in snow in mid-March, and the trailhead is right by my house. As someone who has camped in Colorado for my entire life, solo camping on the CT in March can be risky business if one doesn't spend much time in the backcountry. I try to play it safe. I hang my food in waste, I maintain a small fire and cook at least 20 feet from where I pitch my tent, wash with soap and water before I ever get near where I sleep. I even keep an air horn, bear mace, tactical fixed blade knife, I have a bell on my frame bag, etc. It was like the 5th or 6th time I went up. I can't remember, but I was definitely excited because we had an irregularly hot St. Patrick's Day one week, and a whole new section of the trail was accessible that was covered in snow and mud the previous weeks. So I checked and rechecked all my gear, made sure I had enough layers in case it dipped down into the teens, and headed out from my apartment into Littleton. It's pretty awesome being able to ride from your front door, and 45 minutes later you are deep in the forest, even though I live in a pretty populated city. At any rate, I was new to the CT, and once I got past Bear Creek, everything was brand new to me. It was perfect. The single track wasn't muddy, the birds were chirping. I came around one particular corner just past Bear Creek, and I saw a full suspension trek leaning up against a tree. That's curious. I kept on, and about 100 yards from the bike, I started to hear someone sawing with a handsaw. Finally, I go to a clear section where I could see up ahead some ways, and there was a downed tree blocking the trail, with a guy in his mid-50s with long brown hair, a flannel shirt, and jeans was sawing the tree to clear the trail. He was a nice guy, said he'd been riding the trail for decades, and comes up every spring to clear the downed trees. So I helped him clear the big-ass tree out. He had already done all the cutting, and I helped him pull all the sections off of the trail. He was very interested in my journey, my gear, and where I was heading. Not too interested, but as a mountain biker, he seemed excited for me. I feel like now, in retrospect, I definitely gave him too much information. Somehow, while speaking to him, I told him I wasn't armed, where I was heading to, that I was new to the CT, etc., etc. He seemed like a genuinely good guy, and when a couple of dudes are hauling logs together, it's easy to let your guard down while chit-chatting. As we were parting ways, he tells me that there's a beautiful spot about half a mile up the trail on the right. He said there was a campfire pit, and it was sheltered from the wind by by these cliffs, and it had an amazing view of Waterton Canyon. I was tired after riding all the way from my apartment, hauling logs, and it was getting later in the afternoon, so it sounded great. I followed his directions and I found the site. He had even told me about some tools he leaves wrapped in a waxed canvas bag under this cliff ledge. Surprisingly, I found it right after I set up my tent. It had a handsaw, a hatchet, a hammer, and a few other hand tools. I used it to cut a bunch of wood to get me through the night and put it back under the ledge where I found it. I ate a good dehydrated meal, followed up with some cherry cobbler, chilled by the fire, smoked a bowl, cleaned up, and went to bed. The first few times sleeping alone in the forest were definitely scary, and I laid awake jumping at every sound the first night sleeping up there. But this was the 5th or 6th time, so I had started bringing earplugs up with me so I could actually catch some Z's. Well, eventually I was sleeping and something woke me the F right up. I don't know what it was, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I found my headlamp, popped my head out of my REI quarter dome, nada. I put my clothes back on and got out of the tent with my bear mace and my fixed blade at the ready. I remember it was irregularly warm for mid-late March, but after something woke me up, there was no wind, no sound, nothing. Just still and silent. I looked around with 2 flashlights and didn't see anything. No eyes, nothing. Man, I'm getting goosebumps just typing this. I forgot to mention I also keep a personal jogging alarm that screams at 130 decibels when you pull the pin. I pulled the pin to scare away anything that was near. I might not have heard it, but something definitely woke me up out of a dead sleep while I was wearing earplugs. I can't really explain it. It's not logical, but right at that moment, after firing off the jogging alarm, something sent a wave of fear through my entire body. It was as if I was paralyzed for a minute or so. This was not my first time camping solo by any means, and it wasn't just in my head. Something freaked me the F out. If I was car camping, I would have thrown the entire tent and all my crap in without breaking anything down and sped the F out of there. It's not that easy bike packing. I had to sit there and properly pack all of my gear and make sure everything was balanced properly. It took me close to 15 minutes to get packed, and I was literally terrified the entire time as if something or someone was watching me from close by. I finally got everything packed and started biking it out of there, and it was a little bit of downhill, and then about 1.5 miles of harsh uphill single-track riding, even harder with 23 pounds of extra gear, and in the middle of the night and being terrified. So I'm chugging it up the single track at like 2 in the morning in my easiest gear going slow AF. I could actually see pretty well though. The moon wasn't full, but almost. I was about halfway up the last really harsh incline before I got to the intersection at Lenny's Rest, after which it was all downhill all the way home. So I was really pushing harder than normal to get to the rest. I was still scared, but it seemed to have subsided a bit due to the adrenaline from the cardio when all of a sudden, I effing hear something walking like 4 feet to my right off the trail. I literally froze. I don't think I've ever been so scared in my entire life. It was steep there, so I had no choice but to jump off of my bike. I yelled as loud as I could, "Get the F out here, you MF, or I will cut your damn throat." That didn't do anything, and I heard whatever large animal this was shifted its stance or something, and some twigs cracking. The forest was thick AF to my right, and I couldn't see 5 feet. Whatever this thing was, it was like 4 feet away. I couldn't see anything, and I started yelling, "Yo, bear, over here," over and over again as I started hiking my bike. It was too steep there to jump back on and ride from a standstill, so I had to get some momentum. Well, I finally got enough momentum to get back on the bike, and I continued up the trail. I had to get off and hike a few more times, and at this point, I am effing screaming at the top of my lungs because I keep hearing something walking really close to me. It almost sounded human. I finally get to Lenny's Rest at the very tippy top of the hill, and I am effing exhausted from pushing myself so hard. I stopped to catch my breath at Lenny's Rest. I didn't get off my bike, but just stopped and was holding myself up on Lenny's bench, and F me if I didn't hear something running uphill towards me from like 20 feet down the hill to my right that I just ascended. If anyone's ever been on segment 1 of the CT, you know that when you're heading back to Denver from Lenny's Rest, you know that it's like a launch pad with nothing but 7.4 miles of downhill. Starting out steep with winding single track, switchbacks, and levels out once you get off the single track and onto the water road. Something was running at me fast and effing fast uphill. I don't know what the F it was, whether it was human, cougar, black bear, but I knew something was stalking me for the last hour, and I thought I was home free once I got to Lenny's Rest. So you can imagine how terrifying it was when I heard branches crunching loud and something was literally running right at me. I took off down the single track faster than I have ever done in the daylight. In retrospect, this was so stupid because there are literally cliffs on each corner of the switchbacks, and if I effed up even a little, I would have flown off of a cliff, but I didn't give an F at the moment, and I was carving around the switches like an effing professional MTB racer. I was flying, but at one point, about halfway down, I always have to get off the bike at this one really rocky spot with a boulder. I slowed down and got off, walked the bike around the corner, got back on, and before I took off, I got real quiet and listened, and I kid you not, I could hear something above me effing crashing down through the trees. Effing bypassing the normal trail and switchbacks and just effing crashing straight down the mountain for me. I'd say whatever the F this thing was, it was around 100 yards up the mountain from where I was. I effing hit it in high gear again. Effing balls to the wall, didn't stop again, didn't look back, breaking land speed records from that point all the way down until I was on Wadsworth Boulevard. So I feel like from listening to all of these stories, when OP says they were camping out in the woods or somewhere remote, when they say they have a mystical, unexplainable feeling of dread, something is apparently stalking them, it seems. Even if they can't see it, it's like the universe, their body, whatever you believe in is being like, hey, you need to be scared right now and running if you can. What are all these stories? I'm not saying that they're fake. I'm just like, what is going on in the woods, man? Is Bigfoot out there? Well, yes, of course he is. We already know that part, duh. Next story. Story number 42. Maybe I'm a little late for the party, but I do still have a story. I was in the army. It was pitch black. Me and my battle buddy had guard duty at Checkpoint Charlie. We were in a forest in a temporary camp. I'm sorry, I don't know the English term for it. The time was around 1 a.m., and while I was looking through our night vision equipment, I could see what resembled 4 people trying to crawl into our encampment. I follow protocol and call up our guard commander, whom tells me that there shouldn't be anyone out there, but to keep observing them and report back. We were on a drill and there weren't planned situations this night. I give the night vision to my buddy and he sees the exact same 4 shapes, crawling very, very slowly in the direction of our trenches. So next step is to stop them. I update my guard commander about the situation and about what I intend to do. I then get up out of our trench and go to the edge of the camp, with my rifle drawn and shout at them to stand up, with their hands above their heads and identify themselves. There is no response. My buddy is looking through the night vision the entire time and confirms to me that there is indeed someone out there. My guard commander then comes running down with his pistol drawn, looks through his night vision goggles that he had on himself, and confirms what I see. And the second he runs out there in anger to kick the crap out of them, they're gone. They didn't get up running, they just weren't there anymore. I can't for the life of me explain how, what, and why. Story number 43. When I was a teenager, my friend decided she wanted us to camp out in the woods behind her house. So, a big group of us girls took her tent out about 1/8 of a mile into the woods to set up camp. Later that night, we were all in the tent telling ghost stories when this large shadow started walking around the tent. The fire was still going pretty strong. It kept circling, and we could hear sniffing around the tent. Where she lived, bear sightings were extremely rare, but they did happen on occasion. We all got really scared, and I proceeded to dive under the blankets in the middle of the tent. One of my friends, Rainey, had a I don't really care attitude and just decided to open the tent and look outside. It was the birthday girl's next door's freaking Great Dane. He stuck his head in the tent and started licking Rainey's face. Apparently, he ran off from the neighbor's house into the woods and must have heard us. He stuck around with us for the rest of the night and walked back with us to the birthday girl's house. We called the neighbor and he came and picked up the dog. And I never lived down hiding under the blankets. Story number 44. My family has a cabin. It's really just an old mobile home in the middle of the woods in northern Michigan. We've had it for years and years, but only recently some unexplained odd things had happened, and the police have been out to search the place. The last time I went to the cabin was the worst experience. I went up with my friend. For context purposes, we're 2 girls in our late 20s, and we arrived at dark. We got out and unloaded, but had trouble turning on the power. It has an outside electrical box because the lock was frozen shut. We were trying to get it unstuck, but kept hearing noises around the cabin. Finally, it sounded like the noises were very close to us, and we weren't getting anywhere with the lock. We rushed inside in case it was a bear milling around. We sat inside for maybe 5 minutes before deciding to drive out to the nearest town to get a motel for the night. We would come back once it was light to get the power on. We grabbed a few things and headed back to our car. I got in, turned on the car, but nothing happened. The car was 100% unresponsive. The doors wouldn't even lock. My car had absolutely no issues. We had just driven 3 hours to the cabin without any problems. Something had to have happened to the car in the few minutes we were inside. I told my friend we needed to get back inside, and we got to the door and locked up behind us. We looked at each other, suddenly scared. Our car was totally dead. We had absolutely zero cell service and we had no power. We tried to stay calm. We made a new game plan. We were just going to rough it out for the night, and then at first light walk in the direction of civilization until we got cell signal or ran into help. Only a short time later, we were sitting together in the living room quietly talking, and then suddenly, there was two sharp, loud knocks on the back door of the cabin. We both absolutely froze. We sat there, horrified and shaking, just waiting for someone to push their way into the door or window. This was a mobile home, so it would take very minimal effort to break in. We were met with only silence, but now knew someone was outside. What did they want? It was much scarier to think that they hadn't broke in. They just potentially sabotaged our car and were now knocking on our door to toy with us. We sat silent and terrified, and after a while we started talking again, only to have something bang on a window, just one loud smack. I've never been so scared. We quickly realized we just had to stay alert and awake until morning. We just had to hope that whatever was outside didn't try to get in. It didn't, but the pattern of knocks on the window continued for hours. As soon as the sun was up, we ventured outside. We took a look under the hood of my car next, and it turns out that the bolt that clamps the metal piece to the battery terminal was loosened almost completely. The nut was all the way loosened. One or two turns more and they would have fallen off completely. Story number 45. My grandfather had this second house out in Wilmington, Ohio. Super country area, especially for me since we're from Cincinnati. It had a large pond with lots of fish in it, so we would go out there to have family cookouts and to fish. Me and my brother would often go exploring in the woods as children tend to do, making up adventures, using sticks as swords or guns. We had been in this area many times over the years, but one particular year, we went into the woods and noticed something super strange. There was this weird camp set up in the woods with all these strange symbols painted on the trees and on the table set up out there. Like real demonic looking crap. The oddest thing was that there was an effing school bus hoisted up in the damn trees, like 30 feet off the ground, set between two big-ass trees. How they ever got a bus up there is beyond me. Anyways, there was a tent out there with the symbols painted on it, and me and my big brother played with the idea of going inside to see what was in, but noped the F out of there. To this day, I have never seen anything like it. Grandpa ended up selling the place, so we haven't been back since. Also, as for extra stories, also in the woods was a shanty town of sorts, like houses made of sheet metal set up right in the middle of the woods, clothes hanging out to dry and everything. Thought that was pretty strange. And being black, my grandfather had a secret room behind a movable wall set up in a bathroom in the house, just in case the Klan ever comes for me, as he said. We got a kick out of that one. Story number 46. I wrote this on a previous Reddit post about this subject, so I'm copying and pasting. This will probably be buried anyways. I decided on a whim to drive 4 hours or so to camp along the Mississippi River in Illinois for a few days to detox from a drug habit. I had decided I would go to the area that is managed by the Army Corps of the Engineer because it's public land and free for camping. I got there, found a nice location, and started a fire. Bear in mind, this isn't a campground or anything, it's just a plot of public wilderness. It started raining, so I set up camp, put out the fire, and went to bed. I awoke to some rustling around outside my tent. I looked outside, and staring at my tent was a homeless dude whose face was covered in scars, probably some sort of skin disease. He was literally about 10 feet away from the door of my tent, and when I opened it up, he was looking right at me. It was pretty scary, but he seemed like a nice dude. We started talking for a while. It had already quit raining, and he had a fire going. It was probably about 6 o'clock in the morning at the time. He kept talking about the weirdest crap, and he also kept asking me for a cigarette every 5 minutes, even though I told him every time that I don't have any, and I don't smoke. He kept offering me trades, and even offered me his elaborate hobo stove for a cigarette. He had obvious mental issues, and was likely schizophrenic. He was showing me all of his animal hides, and his bicycle was covered in snake skins. He was telling me about how he would kill things, and when he'd eat them, he would gain their strength and intelligence. He was really kind of interesting, actually, and I enjoyed talking to him. He was teaching me about how to kill, trap, and skin dozens of different types of animals for hours. He was teaching me all sorts of survival techniques. I was honestly learning a lot of crap from him. The conversation was getting weirder and weirder, and at one point I recall him telling me about how he SAs to gain the energy of his victims. The man rambled when he talked. His train of thought was quite sporadic, and it was kind of hard to gather exactly what he was talking about, but I'm pretty confident he wasn't only talking about SAing human females, but animals as well. I was honestly getting really creeped out at this point. I don't think he was actually going to hurt me or SA me or anything. He was kind of a small, feeble guy, and he actually seemed genuinely enlightened that he had a human to talk to, and there's a good chance he hadn't actually had any human interaction for quite some time. We basically talked for most of the day, we shared some rice and beans, and he showed me basically basically what he does for the day. Showed me how he cooks, showed me how he boils his water, etc. Well, it was getting dark again, and I was thinking about his knives that he had shown me, and that I really didn't want to go to sleep with him around. I told him I was going to run to town to grab some cigarettes, and I would be right back. He was thrilled. So I drove the F away to some crap-ass town on the other side of the river called Clinton, Iowa. Found some casino, lost $5, and then fell asleep in a park right next to a playground. I woke up to the sound of children playing, and then I drove home. My trip was ruined. So for exactly like 1 second, I thought OP was going to go get the guy cigarettes. But also, one thing I've noticed in my temporary filling in on Undersparked, why do so many comments start with, "This will probably get buried anyways"? Like, why are so many Reddit posters downers on themselves? Who cares? There's been a few times where I've just skipped reading it because I'm thinking to myself, well, let's just skip to the part that matters. But do you think somebody goes through the comment section and says, "Oh, God, a Reddit comment with 5 upvotes, disgusting," and then they downvote it and snort and then maybe spit on their screen or something? No need for the pre-warning that it will get buried anyway. I don't know, that's just a Reddit pet peeve. Next story. Story number 47. All right, time for my story since I've been reading this for more than 6 hours now. Was out with 7 friends in very rural Australia and had limited supplies after an incident back at camp. We were hiking to the nearest town by ourselves. A few hours into the hike and it starts getting dark, like pitch black dark. Though the stars are extremely vibrant and beautiful, we kept following the small 4x4 trail that we'd been on and come to a small clearing next to a small stream. We just sat down next to some rocks and drank a bit out of it when all of a sudden I got this weird nauseating butterfly feeling, like before you go on stage in front of a crowd or something. But it didn't feel bad or malicious. I asked the others if they had it too, and that's when we saw it. A little bit further down the stream, there were hundreds, maybe thousands of glowing orb things, all in different colors, just pulsating and glowing. It was so weird but mesmerizing, actually, and we watched it till they kind of faded. And that's when it happened. That dread feeling like so many people here described. I sat paralyzed in fear, too scared to move or I'd just die or something. I looked at my friend, and her face said it all. It was completely pale, and her eyes looked hollow. It was honestly manic. After that, in almost unison, we all jumped up and booked it out of there. I don't know what the hell happened when those orb things disappeared, but it felt like the goosebumps lasted hours, and I felt cold as ice. It was 25-ish degrees that night, and I still can't explain it, but I thought I would share. Story number 48. I was once camping in the Santa Barbara backcountry with a couple of friends about a 10-mile hike in from the trailhead. The last morning of our trip, as we were making breakfast and packing up our campsite, we heard voices on the hillside up above our camp. At first, we thought it was a couple of guys coming down the trail, but their voices didn't get louder or closer, and we realized they must have been watching us or talking to each other, not realizing we could hear them. After about an hour, they came down the trail. 2 middle-aged white men with rifles and backpacks with antlers sticking out. One was short and stocky, and one tall and slender. The short one came marching off the trail towards us and said in a gruff voice, "So, what kind of weed are you guys smoking?" And we, of course, had been smoking weed, but I didn't see how that was any of his business. Well, my friend answered and replied, "Oh, you know, just swag, but we just finished it off." At which point he proceeds to bring a pipe out of his own shirt pocket and exclaimed, "Well, we'll just have to smoke mine then." Then the tall and slender man still had not spoken or said anything, and something just felt off. He passed the pipe to my 2 friends first, who both took a hit, and then to me, and I refused, saying that I didn't smoke. The short man then asked me to hold his backpack, which he slung off his back and basically threw at me. There were antlers sticking out of the top and blood dripping out the bottom, and he asked me, "How much do you think that weighs?" To which I responded, I don't know, maybe 35 to 40 pounds? Apparently, I was dead on, and he explained that they had butchered the deer in the backcountry to bring back the meat, which he shoved right in his backpack. This is when they introduced themselves as Ralph and Keith and proceeded to tell us that they had been childhood friends growing up in Santa Barbara and used to hunt deer in the area as kids. Their whole lives, they've met up for a hunting trip in the area every year. Keith, the slender, quiet one, married a DA in SB County, and Ralph had moved up to the mountains outside Yosemite and married a, quote, nice fat woman who baked, and walked the power lines through the mountains, inspecting for fallen trees, branches, and the like. They ended up being cool, if not weird, older dudes, and I kinda wished I had smoked with them, but I think I made the right decision in the moment. Story number 49. As Asians, or maybe just Southeast Asians, we're thought to never, ever disrespect the forest as there are other beings living there. Amongst the things we're warned against doing, 1. Shouting or screaming your name or a friend's name. The forest spirit will then learn your name, mimic yours or a friend's voice, and lead you astray. If you happen to hear your name from a disembodied voice in a forest, do not answer to it. 2. urinating, defecating, spitting by a tree or plant. Forest guides believe that sometimes spirits resides in tree trunks, specifically the banana because it has a heart-shaped fruit, not the banana itself, or bamboo trees because bamboo is hollow. So doing your business by them might invoke their anger. If you have to go, pick somewhere without obvious huge plants or trees and ask permission. For example, "Excuse me, please forgive me, but I really need to go. I hope you don't mind." 3. Taking things like stones, leaves, flowers, etc. back home with you. Bad luck will befall you because they do not belong to you, but to the forest. Some of the objects may be cursed as well by forest spirits. And finally, 4. Breaking away from your group and venturing off on your own, even for a few minutes. If you go off on your own, the spirit will make you disoriented with mimicked voices and get you lost deep in the forest, so that it can eventually claim you. Story number 50. I've posted this before, but people seem to think it was a story worth hearing. A few summers ago, me and a few buddies went catfishing at a local reservoir. This is rural Ohio, and the reservoir was off a dirt road with about 2 miles from the village it fed, which was a village of about 1,500 people. We had fished that spot tons of times before, and we very rarely saw other people during the day, and we never saw anyone out there at night. So the day we went out, it was about 9 p.m. Sun's going down, we had a couple cases of beer, and we were planning on staying out until the sun came back up. We didn't want to be bothered, we weren't really allowed to have alcohol around the reservoir anyway, so we actually drove a dirt service road clear around the reservoir as far as we could get away from the road in. The service road was nothing but compacted dirt, with trees, roots running across it, areas that had washed away during flooding, fallen trees in the road that had been there for years, etc. This was not a well-traveled road, and the only way we got around it was that we all had lifted 4x4 trucks or jeeps. The site we picked out is a piece of land that stretches out into the water a bit in a teardrop kind of shape, goes maybe 20 feet out into the reservoir, so we have water on all sides of us besides our back. We figure we can go fish from different directions. Since we will still have 5 or 6 poles in the water, it would give us a little more room to cast without tangling lines. Plus, there were remnants of a fire pit and some wood that was already collected. So we get to start a fire, bait our poles, and start drinking. We fish for maybe 2 or 3 hours and get good and drunk. In the meantime, a thick summer fog creeps across in the pond. Then we hear a huge kersploosh and we see the ripples coming from across the water to our right. There was maybe 50 yards of water between us and the other bank, and the fog was so thick we could not see the bank or what caused the sound, but we could see the ripples in the water once they got to us. We explain it away to a tree limb falling in the water or maybe a beaver jumping off the bank. Do beavers jump? And we keep fishing. About 20 minutes later, another huge kersploosh and the ripples come again. And let me tell you, there was no mistaking the sound. It was not a fish flopping, and it was not a frog jumping in the water. It was the sound of a large, heavy object, like the sound someone makes when they do a cannonball off the diving board. But we explain it away as we did with the first. Shortly after that, we run out of wood for the fire, so we leave the one guy to watch the poles, and me and a few buddies go into the brush to find fallen sticks and whatnot. We all go our separate ways and meet back at the fire shortly after. One of my buddies comes back to the fire with a white jacket, a pair of rubber boots, and a clown mask in his arms, and this was about the time when there were all those posts about the scary clowns who would lurk around towns to scare people. I knew those stories were bullcrap, so I figured it was just leftover from dumb idiot kids who had a party out there one night and left it. So we get the fire going again. We fish for a little while longer when we hear twigs breaking in the woods across the water, and then another huge kersploosh. At this point, we know there was someone out there with us, and the sound has to be someone dropping something in the water. So we call out and we're like, "Hey, if there is someone out there, we aren't making trouble, just fishing and drinking some beers. We'd be happy to have you to join us." Dead silence. So we again call out, to no response. A couple of my buddies are seriously freaking out at this point between the booze, the clown mask, the fog, and the mystery noises. So I get that drunk courage, you know the kind, and I decide we should all go walk around the bend and see just what the F is going on. This guy's being an effing a-hole and trying to scare us. I convinced 2 of my buddies to come with me, and the other 2 guys watched the poles. So we 3 trek into the bush with our flashlights, make our way through the thick-ass fog, start working around this lake, and as we go, we start finding bits of trash, and saplings that had been cut down, and then more trash, and then footprints of someone in their bare feet. Which is odd, since it was so much work to get back to this spot on the lake. No one would be hiking around this far around the lake to fish in this spot. As I'm sweeping the woods with my flashlight, I walk over the crest of a hill, and not 10 feet in front of my face is a tent. This tent had been there for a long time. There was moss growing on the sides of it, and there was trash and crap thrown all around this campsite. Most concerning, though, was the pile of propane tanks. There had to have been 15 or 20 of those 5-gallon propane tanks. So we all looked at each other, and I said, "Welp, I guess this is none of my business," and we hurriedly made our way back to the fire, threw all of our crap in the back of the trucks, and made our way out of there in a hurry. On the way out from around the reservoir, we pull out onto the main, still dirt road and pass a crappy little Toyota Camry with 5 dudes in it. Watching in the rear view, they pull onto the service road that we just left out of. So, for those that aren't savvy to rural southern Ohio, we busted a meth lab in the middle of the woods. The owner of said meth lab tried to scare us away by throwing crap in the lake. I can only assume that when throwing crap in the lake didn't scare us away, the meth cook called some of his buddies to scare us out. Or worse yet, the meth cook called his buddies after we saw his operation, in which case, I'm glad we got out of there before they showed up. Story number 51. I told this story on another thread a while back on an old account that I've since deleted, but my buddy was camping in northern Ontario about a decade ago. It was him and one other guy. Everything was going great. They caught a bunch of fish and fried some up for dinner. They hung up the rest of the catch in the trees for the evening. The sun was down and they were relaxing. As they sat by the fire, they heard sounds coming from the bush. There were normal animal sounds, leaves crunching, twigs snapping, easily a squirrel or raccoon, but there were also strange laughing sounds. My buddy looks in his periphery and sees what he describes as a little Spider-Man, and his camping partner sees the same thing, a little human-like figure like a hunched dwarf, end quote, and they get spooked and run a few meters from camp. When they return, all the fish is gone from the trees in only a matter of a few minutes. This by itself is not that scary. It could have been raccoon, porcupine, whatever. The eyes play tricks, and my buddy is a scientist, so he is not easily swayed by extraordinary explanations. Then, fast forward to me in the Ontario archives doing research for my dissertation, I came across an interview with early 20th century explorer Ernest Oberholzer. He recounts stories from his indigenous travel companion and guide who said that the people north of Lake Superior spoke in an odd language, and there were little people or dwarves who made strange sounds and played tricks on people. Same area my buddy was camping in, similar descriptions too. I immediately messaged my buddy, and if anything, a fun story, but creepy if we let our imaginations run wild. Story number 53. I will repost my story. I'd like to know if anyone else has had similar experiences with cryptids. I'm an outdoorsman. I'm very experienced in hunting, camping, hiking, and general survival. I am very familiar and used to wildlife, and I was charged by what I believe was a cryptid called a dogman. It charged me and my cousin. It was not a bear. A bear cannot move how it did, and it was not a normal wolf as they can't comfortably run on 2 legs, whereas what charged us seemed natural at doing it. I can elaborate further if you wish. This happened around June or July of 2007, I believe. I was around 17 years old and more cocky then, but still somewhat knowledgeable of the outdoors. My family used to own a cabin in northwest Wisconsin. I basically grew up there in the summer. I knew the woods well, but at night it was wise to stay in the cabin or at least by the bonfire by the beach because of bears, wolves, and cougars. One of the creepiest things was if you were having a bonfire, the tree line was visible from the fire pit and the beach, and at night you always felt like you were being watched from that tree line. But during the day, the woods always seemed normal, not so creepy, that is, until this incident. So this happened somewhere between 1200 to 1400. Me and my cousin were having an airsoft battle. I was in full woodland camo, he was not. I retreated onto the ATV trail into the woods for a tactical advantage, and our battle took us about 200 meters into about a third of the way up the trail. We had enough at this point and were standing at the edge of a clearing on the trail talking, and he was maybe 10 feet from me. When I decided to mess with him, I shushed him and said, "We're being watched," and he froze. Then I realized the woods were dead quiet, and I got spooked and started scanning the tree line and the other edge of the clearing from left to right. When I saw it, its teeth gave it away. It was panting and staring at my cousin. I don't expect you to believe me, but what I saw was a wolf as big as a black bear, at least 300 pounds. But it wasn't normal. This wolf was on 2 legs crouching next to the tree with its arm grasping the tree. Grasping with a clawed hand. It had reddish-brown fur. I told my cousin that we have to go. And the next thing I know, he is sprinting. And I look back at Wolfie, who had locked on and sprinted a few steps on 2 feet. And then I turned and ran when it looked like Wolfie was dropping to all 4s. It charged us and sounded right on our asses, barreling through the bush, but for whatever reason, let us go when we broke out of the tree line and headed back for the cabin. What stuck with me the most was the sheer size. Wolfie appeared to be nearly 7 feet tall when upright, and that where it should have had front paws, it appeared to have large clawed hands. Now, I'm not sure how to explain it away rationally. I have heard wolves will occasionally kind of walk upright, but as far as I know, they can't sprint on 2 legs, nor do wolves get that big, and black bears more so waddle on 2 legs. The The closest description is silly, but a werewolf or a dog man. Thanks for reading. Story number 54. Boyfriend and I went camping with two other couples. I took them to a favorite spot of mine about 3 hours out of town and definitely deep into the forest. I had been going to it for years with my family, but our friends were more used to by the lake camping and are more city folk. I know the kind of people who are out there, like off-grid hippies and mostly tweakers. There's a known rumor of meth labs out there, and I know to keep my mouth shut. Our friends, however, did not. So anyways, we had just eaten dinner and are all sitting by the campfire drinking when we suddenly hear something yell, "Marcus!" very loudly. It was a woman's voice and she was obviously in distress, but the thing was, she was coming from the east, which is the opposite direction anyone would be coming from, except for those tweakers. I instantly fell silent, not wanting to draw attention to our little group, but one of our friends yells back, "Polo," thinking the woman had yelled Marco and thought it would be funny. Well, the woman heard our friend and proceeded to yell through the very dark night, asking us how to get to our camp. I told everyone to be quiet, hoping she would move along, but that's when she saw the fire. She continued to yell obscenities as she made her way towards us, and at one point she clearly fell down the hill we were below because we could hear a crash and some wood crackle, which she also blamed us on because we were shining a very bright light at her and she couldn't see, and the only light out there was the fire, and we still couldn't see her because of it. She was definitely tripping balls, which made me more anxious because you never know what someone like that will do. So after about 10 minutes of her trampling through the forest and falling down a few times, she finally started to walk into view. This was when the rest of my friends had that "oh crap" moment. She was clearly a meth head and in very bad shape, and she wanted to stay to eat and sleep in our camp. She insisted to the point of plopping her ass down on the ground next to us and refusing to leave. She had never once asked us to help her or if she could even come into our camp, and she was very rude. I would have been happy to help her, but she was high and very twitchy and pretty much demanded things from us that we weren't going to give. So my boyfriend, a very bulky and quite scary dude when you make him mad, finally stood up and grabbed her a water bottle and told her she had to leave now. She whined some more in a very childish manner and yelled at us that we weren't God's children, but he forced her to get up and she turned away towards the way that she came. She continued to yell into the night about how rude and unkind we were. Nicer equivalents to what she said, really, and at one point she dropped the water bottle we gave her, and she blamed us for that too. We could slowly hear her yelling becoming farther and farther away, but what scared me the most was her coming back later. She already knew where we were, and let's just say that none of us slept that night. And I hope to God my friends learned their lessons. You don't F around in the forests. There are people out there that know it better than you. That's not the first time I've come into contact with unwanted people. Story number 55. This was really terrifying for me, but I guess funny for others. So I was younger, but definitely old enough to know better. Around 16-ish, I'm 23 now. We were on a family camping trip, which we took annually, or at least a couple of times a year. It was raining pretty hard, and I kept hearing this awful moaning noise. It sounded like a large group that was moving. I kept waking my mom up and asking what the hell it was, but she just kept saying it's nothing, go to bed. Cue the irrational zombies fear. I honestly thought it was zombies. It was loud and scary and moving, and I have just never heard it before. Finally, after waking my mom up for the nth time, she yells something along the lines of, "Damn it, they're just cows. They're mooing to stay together. Go back to sleep." And I was embarrassed for honestly considering it was zombies. I really thought it was something creepy out there, and I still thought it was freaking zombies for a good while though. Story number 56. I grew up in the middle of nowhere. We used to go camping all the time with different groups of friends. We all had tons of different lakes and places to go to, and one night there were 4 of us, 2 guys, 2 girls, all around 19 years old, and 2 tents. Where we had been lots of times before, as it is a great spot by the lake. That night, just before dark, we all decided to go fishing about a minute or 2 walk away from our campsite. We were gone for about an hour. We came back and our campsite was completely gone. Everything, tent, coolers, our stuff, everything but what we took fishing with us. There is no possible way a person could have taken it, as where we were, there's only one way in and out, and we were fishing in the entrance. We were about a 10-minute canoe ride back to our vehicles with the spotlights that were still in them, and thank God I still had my keys in my pocket as it had a bottle opener on it. We went back the next day and there was not a sign of any of our stuff, like nothing at all. What's crazy is there was about a 40-foot cliff straight behind us, and the actual place we were camping was about 300 feet by 300 feet with rocks on both sides. It freaks me out thinking about it to this day, what could have possibly happened to all of our stuff. Story number 57. Not camping per se, I live in the woods. Back in the 50s, the state had been buying land from farmers. One farmer refused to sell all his land to the state and instead sold parcels along a seasonal road to private entities. In the 1970s, my father purchased a 38-acre parcel from the farmer and built a home. Years later, my parents would buy out another neighbor's home and raise it. Surrounding our now 50-acre parcel is a 900-plus acre state-owned forest surrounding that is another 3,000 acres of national forest. I wanted to paint a picture for when I say I live in the woods, I effing mean I live in the woods. Bobcats, deers, bears, mountain lions, coyote packs of 15 to 40, coy dogs, even a badger every once in a while that I've seen while out in my backyard. Now for the strange. I've been witness to a great many events that defy all reason. Once while in my living room hanging around with friends, a steel water bottle, one of the ones with twist-off caps, about a liter, jumped 2 feet straight up off the table and came back landing down in the same ring of condensation it flew up from. We all left the room. Again, with some friends over playing video games in the living room, we're all chatting and the game is loud. An awkward pause as the loading screen music stops suddenly. The game froze. We all fell silent. Behind us, coming from the kitchen, I hear the sink's faucet on in full bore. No one had been in that part of the house. In fact, you don't even have to go by the kitchen to get to the living room, and due to the wider doorway from the non-kitchen side, most people don't even know that it's back there when they walk through. There's also a light fixture in the bathroom that no matter how many times I rewire or fix it or replace the fixture, one bulb will always not light up. 3-bulb fixture, middle not lighting. 2-bulb fixture, left will never light up. I've even ran separate circuits from 2 different ends of the house, 2 breaker boxes, and still nothing. Also, any computer, TV, stereo will randomly switch on or off on their own, regardless of switch type or power source. This only happens when you are not in direct line of sight of the device. Remote controls with batteries out of them and even sometimes unplugged devices get split-second moments of power. Then some more surroundings. The house is about 200 feet below the peak of the ridgeline of the mountain. The driveway extends east up the hill. We are on the western face, and below us to the northwest, west, and southwest is the majority of the forest. There are state-run hiking trails that actually cross our property due to poor mapping on the state's part. Within a 2-mile hike in 3 directions, there are hundreds of unmarked graves, old foundations of shine shacks and smuggler dens. There are stone staircases in the sides of the hills that lead nowhere and come from nothing. I have never for a moment, though, felt threatened or endangered. But I have felt that I was not alone, even if I was. I have hiking stories as well that are more creepy and more supernatural stuff that I can describe around the house, and I will be happy to share more if there are interested parties. Story number 58. Boyfriend and I planned a 5-day trip in Southern California. We had met each other while through hiking the Appalachian Trail, so we both had plenty of experience. We went to Whole Foods to buy our food for this trip and indulged for such a short trip that we weren't worried our packs would be too heavy. We wanted to eat nice food. So the second day, we hiked to a state that was perhaps 30 meters from a dirt service road. By the road, there was a large trough to feed horses. We decided to put our food bags under that as it was large and heavy and already overturned. This would keep us safe from bears and our food safe from animals. Well, we woke up in the morning to get our food and half of it was gone. I mean, from the 2 food bags, someone had picked out select foods and taken them. This was not an animal, it was a human. But the thing that creeped me out was wondering if the other person had seen us come and place the food there, all while we were thinking we were alone. We were miles from the nearest town, so even though there was a service road, it's not like we were near any civilization. We turned around and went back as we no longer had enough food for our trip. Story number 59. I grew up down a long dirt road in rural Alabama. My family owns a decent amount of land. I still miss the peacefulness sometimes, but I'm a gamer, so I need my high-speed internet. Anyway, the first time my friend and I decided to camp by ourselves, we were about 12 years old, we picked a spot in a field that was right at the edge of the woods. We really weren't that far from the house, maybe 500 to 600 yards. Far enough to make us feel like we were being brave, but close enough to haul ass back to the house if needed. Everything was going fine. We had a tiny fire and plenty of junk food to gorge ourselves with. It was probably around 10 or 11 that things took a turn for the worse. We were both just sitting and staring at the flames. There wasn't much noise that night because it was early winter and the bugs had pretty much vacated by that time. So all we heard was the crackling of the fire and the occasional wind gusts blowing what few dead leaves might have remained on the trees. And that's when we heard it. I couldn't say exactly how far away the sound was, but it came from the woods. It was a blood-curdling scream, and to this day I've never heard anything in the wild that would even make you as uneasy as that sound. We both looked at each other, and I know that we were thinking run to the house, but we were tough kids, right? So we decided we'd lock ourselves in our tent and brave this new danger that we'd discovered. Neither of us had any clue what noise that was, but we knew we weren't setting a foot outside the tent until the sun came up. My friend ended up actually falling asleep an hour or so later. I didn't have an easy time though. I could see the dying light of the fire glimmering through the tent fabric, and I just laid there watching the light dance until something disturbed it. It was like the fire went out completely, but then it came back and I immediately realized something had walked between the fire and the tent. I covered my head with my sleeping bag, scared to death. I never heard a sound, no footsteps. Nothing ever messed with the food we left outside. And 30 minutes later, I had to uncover my head because I was pouring sweat and about to suffocate myself. I could still see a tiny glow from what was left of the fire, and I couldn't see or hear anything else. I laid there for probably another hour before I finally fell asleep. I awoke to sunlight, and my friend was already up and outside. We talked about the scream, and I told him what I'd seen after he fell asleep. We looked around and could see no tracks or any other signs that something else had been here besides us. And it wasn't until years later and a couple of sightings from different people that we found out what actually made that sound was a panther. Story number 60. I went on a camping retreat with a group of friends when I was just out of high school. We stayed at a campground that was made up of lots of cabins that had those metal bunk beds and a large main cabin with a kitchen and socializing area. It was the first night we were up there, and I wanted to take a walk around the woods near the campgrounds. I walked along some trails until I could no longer see the lights from the cabins and it was practically pitch black. After a little while, my night vision kicked in and I continued my exploratory hike. After about 15 minutes of walking in the dark, I could see a shape ahead of me in the path. I stopped and tried to make out what was there. About 100 feet ahead of me was some small guy or kid standing in the middle of the path. He was standing completely still, and it appeared he was standing in the middle of a bridge that the path led to. I stayed really quiet and started backing away while keeping my eye on him. It was way too dark for me to make out any details about him from where I was, and all I could really see was that he was standing completely still. My nerve finally broke and I just hurried back to the campground. When I got back, I told my friends about what I just saw, and of course, a bunch of them wanted to head out to the forest to check out what I had found too. So, a bunch of us grouped up and I led them back to the bridge where I saw the guy standing. As we got closer to the spot, I could see that he was still standing in the same spot. We all kind of stopped and waited. We started whispering to one another about what we should do now. Some wanted to turn back around, and others wanted me to go over to him to see if he was okay. Being stupid, I agreed. I went ahead of the group and inched my way towards the figure. I was ready to bolt the moment something seemed wrong. So I got close, and when I got to the head of the bridge, I could see what the shape actually was. It was an upright vacuum. Someone had stuck an upright vacuum in the middle of a hiking path for some reason. I guess seeing something so foreign to the surroundings, along with it being complete black and white dark, made our imaginations go a bit wonky. Overall, this was pretty mundane, but the whole experience has stuck with me now for decades. Story number 61. So, me and 3 of my buddies, Andy, Kurt, Morgan, were hiking the AT over summer break. We were only going to be out 3 to 4 days doing a section in PA, and on day 2, we were multiple miles into a state forest and multiple miles away from any roads or towns. As planned, we made it to a public shelter right around dinner time. It was a roof and 3 walls with some wooden bunks built in. We were hustling to get there as some clouds had been rolling in, and we pretty much drop our bags at the shelter and it starts to rain. But it was a summer rain, where it blows in and pours for about 30 minutes and then blows away to reveal blue skies and sunshine. So we were glad to start building a fire and getting dinner ready. And about 5 minutes after the rain had stopped, we hear someone coming down the trail, and we're thinking, oh man, they must have been caught in the rain. However, first around the train is a happy little corgi, dry with his feet barely wet. The corgi ran up to us as we all had our snacks out and started begging for food. Behind him came a middle-aged man slowly moving down the trail. He was wearing blue jeans, a white t-shirt, cowboy boots, had no gear with him, and was also bone dry. At this point, we all start looking at each other because none of this makes sense. We nervously play with the dog for a few minutes as the man takes his sweet time making his way over to the shelter. He walks up and says hello and doesn't really engage in any conversation, seems a bit socially awkward, and we were all too bugged out to try and ask him questions. He came within about 10 feet of us and was just walking around and seemed to be enjoying the scenery. We all looked at him and agreed he was totally dry, with white t-shirt and jeans. It would have been easy to tell if any of it was wet. He then says goodbye and starts to walk back the way he came. Started calling for the dog to follow him, saying, Toby, come on, boy. And the dog had almost no reaction to these remarks. Granted, we had food, but you would expect some kind of reaction. Then I looked closer at the dog, and it was wearing a Barbie pink collar and had a metal ring hanging, but no dog tag attached to it. The man kept walking away and called the dog a few more times until he eventually disappeared down the trail. The dog stayed a few more minutes and then just walked away in the opposite direction they came from, just walked off into the woods. So once they both were gone, we start talking to each other. No one saw any hikers behind us all day, no one saw any tents or shelters set up close by, and we all confirmed on our map that the closest road was miles away. We all agreed he was dry and very strange, and we all agreed the dog seemed to have nothing to do with him, and it had a girl collar and didn't react to the name Toby. We even tried to call it Toby, and it didn't react. So as our minds race, we decide that this man must have been some kind of serial killer hiding out on the trail, living off the hikers he kills, and he killed one with a dog and he decided to keep it. From there, we formulate a plan. Andy had some paracord, and we all had tin cans left from dinner. We set up a perimeter of those noise tarps around the shelter and across the front opening. We also took the wooden picnic table that was next to the shelter and tipped it up against its side to the front to try and secure us inside. Well, nighttime rolls around and it's absolutely pitch black. The fire pit got too wet to keep something going, and we all sleep on the top bunks with our knives ready to go right by our beds. None of us really slept. At the slightest noise, we would jump and then call each other's names to make sure we were all there. I would pass out occasionally and fire off one of my grizzly bear snores and freak everyone else out. At one point, Kurt got down to look out to front and almost got stabbed by Andy as he was trying to climb back on his bunk. Then, later, poor Morgan had to pee and was trying to pee out the front and accidentally hit the string and made the cans rattle. Well, the rest of us were ready to pounce on this silhouette by the front door, and he had to yell, "No, it's just me, it's me!" Otherwise, he would have been a goner. Eventually, we make it through the night, and the sun starts to come up, and we start taking down the table and tarps. We left a note in the shelter sign-in book about Toby and the man that was with him. We diverted out path and moved over near a campground the next night. Set up a concealed camp quarter-mile off the trail. Then, the final morning, we got to the campground payphones and called in for our extraction. None of us have ever forgotten about how terrifying that night was, and since then, we often recall the story of Toby and the man that was with him. So, fellow viewers, what did you learn about camping? I think we learned that it's horrifying and unexplainable, and there's something evil going on lurking in the woods sometimes, and people are crazy, and meth, that's a thing too. And also, there's cougars and panthers that imitate dying, screaming women that want to slash off your face, possibly wear it, and then return to camp, and then go to society living as you, but with a tail and fur. But for real, some of these stories were like absolutely terrifying. But anyway, guys, we are at the end of the video. Thank you all so much for watching. Have a really good day, and bye-bye!